Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Transportation and Parking Commission for Monday, September 27th. We will begin our agenda.
Item 1, regular business agenda. Item 1A, roll call. Commissioner Fod,
Here.
Commissioner Sahakian,
Here.
Commissioner Yakubian,
Here.
Commissioner Wiseman,
Here.
Chairperson Welsh.
Here. Next item, please.
Item 1B, flag salute by Commissioner Welsh.
Everyone, please rise for the flag salute. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. Next item, please.
Item 2, posting of agenda. The agenda for the Monday, September 27, 2010 regular meeting of the Glendale Transportation and Parking Commission was posted by Friday, September 24th, 2010 before 5:30 p.m. on the bulletin board outside of City Hall.
Thank you. Next item.
Item 3, approval of minutes. A, August 23rd, 2010 regular meeting, approval of minutes.
Did anybody have any changes or adjustments to?
Move to approve. Second.
Okay, we'll accept the minutes from August 23rd. And then, next item.
Item 3B, September 8, 2010 special meeting, approval of minutes.
Okay. I did have one correction to make on that one. At the end of my comments, there's a sentence that says Dan Boyle addressed Chairperson Welch's concerns regarding the calculations, but we didn't have any speakers after our comments, so that might have been when we were answering questions, but I'd rather just strike that sentence because he did not speak after that point.
No problem, Chairman. We'll take care of it.
Okay. So any other corrections on the minutes?
No other corrections. Move to approve as revised.
Second.
I will accept the minutes from September 8th. Thank you. Next item.
Item 4, oral communication. Discussion is limited to items not a part of this agenda. Each speaker is allowed 5 minutes. The commission may question the speaker, but there will be no debate or decision.
Do you have any speaker cards for oral communications? Okay, I have no speaker cards for oral communication, so we'll close that public hearing and move on to the next item, please.
Item 5, report only. 5A, presentation by Professor Donald Troop on downtown parking strategies and policies.
Okay, very good. Professor Shoup, please. Just for everybody's knowledge, I invited the professor to come and give us a report on some of the strategies and current research in the field, and he's going to present some of his findings tonight. So with no further ado, Professor Shoup.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Glendale is a leader in parking reforms, and I'm happy to be here to tell you what other cities are doing. I'm certainly, you don't want anybody from Los Angeles telling you what to do. I think that Glendale is making big strides in changing the impression that people have of California. Whenever I'm at any other place in the United States, they think that we paved the entire state over for parking. And large parts of the states do look like this, that too much of our land is devoted to parking. And all those cars in this picture in Silicon Valley are parked free on a weekday afternoon. Now, I think that most of us tend to neglect this asphalt blight, especially when we're parked free in it, as all of these cars are. But I think that, and I'll say it later, I think this gives us a great opportunity to reform. I think that we've made two big mistakes in our parking policies in the United States. One is keeping curb parking free or cheap, and the second is requiring lots of off-street parking. And the reason you have to require a lot of off-street parking is because the curb parking is free. And if a new building comes in with a lot of employees who don't have a lot of parking, they'll park on residential streets or in commercial streets. And the way in the past we've dealt with this is to have high off-street parking requirements. And Glendale does have some very high off-street parking requirements. Here's a graph I put together from your zoning code. The green shows the 1,000 square feet of a building in any particular night use, like a nightclub or a tavern. And the red shows the required parking. So for many of your land uses, you require much more space for parking than for people. And I think that's a mistake. It is one that we can reform and get great benefits from reducing that red bar. I mean, how do you know that a restaurant has to have 3 times more space for parking than for people? Where does that come from exactly? I think if you ask the staff in the planning department, well, where does this parking requirement come from? They couldn't tell you. That's 10 spaces per 1,000 square feet. Well, where does it come from? How do they know that's the right amount? But I think parking is such an emotional issue, and I think that everybody in Glendale is probably aware of the history of parking reforms in Glendale. And here's an article from Time magazine in 1948. And I think every politician is probably aware of the fact that the mayor and 3 council members were recalled over the issue of parking meters. And if you know that you probably are wary of getting too far out ahead of the citizens. But things have changed. Here's an article from the Glendale News Press. When the Merchants Association urged the city to convert free parking into paid parking. I love the idea of modern metered parking. So I do think that partly through the work of your superb consultant, Nelson Nygaard, that you have figured out how to work through the politics of paid parking. And here is just a summary of what was recommended. And I think that these recommendations that were made are very, very good, saying that the prices should be depending on location and time of day, and that they will aim for an occupancy rate, that instead of having the city council micromanage the price of parking, that they will set a policy goal of maybe 1 or 2 vacant spaces on every block. That's what 85% means. That 85% is not the right, it isn't a precise term. What it really stands for is 1 or 2 vacant spaces on every block. And another part of it that is very good, I think, is that you could have various things dealing with minimum parking requirements. You could reduce them, and if you want to change a shoe store into a restaurant, you can do that without adding parking if they're less than 5,000 square feet. So I think along these lines, I would recommend 3 basic reforms. One is charging the right price for curb parking, and by that I mean this lowest price that you can charge to leave 1 or 2 vacant spaces on every block. And then I think you're following this route in Glendale as returning the meters revenue to the neighborhoods that generate it, so that paid parking means the payments for parking will go back to the neighborhood. The payments for parking will go right out the other side of the meter. They'll clean the sidewalk or plant street trees or pay for advertising or Christmas lights or whatever. And I think these things that are paid for are what makes the paid parking politically popular. I think that the things that are paid for should be what the merchants and the property owners and the residents say they want. The city shouldn't tell them what they're going to get. It should be a local decision. And they should be, I think, largely physical things that people can see. They can see that the sidewalks have been replaced, or they can see that the tree grates are kept in shape, or there's extra police patrol or something like that. The money shouldn't disappear into the general fund. And then I think once you've done that, you can reduce or remove the off-street parking requirements. And this will allow a lot better use of the land in the city. So some cities are doing this, that these performance-based prices that they adjust over time, that I think you should realize that the prices should be different at different times of the day and in different locations. For this 85% of the space is occupied, and that means that the spaces will be well used but readily available. Now, what could be better? I mean, these are two different issues. Well used, meaning that they're almost fully occupied all the time, and they're readily available because there's one or two vacant spaces all the time. And how can you do better than that? I think that here's just a graphic that came from San Francisco, who was way out ahead of all the rest of the cities in the United States on this, and say that, well, we don't know what the price will be. It depends. But we have to start from where we are. And maybe it will end up that the price will be high between 8 and 10 a.m., and then it'll go down, and then it'll go back up, and then it'll go down again. That if the city council tells the staff that this is our goal, is about 1 or 2 vacant spaces on every block, make it happen, and give them the responsibility for adjusting or tweaking the prices to let that happen. Now, because they have a federal grant for this, they were able to hire graphic artists to explain, well, what is the problem? Well, the problem is that some blocks, all the spaces are full, and on other blocks, there are quite a few vacancies. And the idea is you just nudge up the price on the upper block and lower it on the other block, and you'll get something like this, which is really what you want. Now, the idea of charging market rate prices for paid parking seems, like a huge social engineering revolution, sort of like Prohibition or the Reformation. How can we go through this wrenching social process of charging market prices for something that used to be free? Well, as you can see, it's not that big a change. I mean, just moving one car from the overoccupied block to the underoccupied block is all that it takes, and it makes the parking much better, both for the merchants on the upper block, because now their customers can never say there's no place to park or there's a shortage of parking, and the people on the lower block get more customers. So everybody wins in that situation. And it's just as simple as what you learn as a little kid about Goldilocks. Porridge shouldn't be too hot or too cold. Well, parking prices shouldn't be too high or too low, and the goal is to get them right. San Francisco also had a little video explaining what they're doing. The prices
Finding a parking space can be frustrating and time-consuming. It's estimated close to a third of city traffic is caused by drivers circling while looking for a space. Some drivers just give up and double park. This clogs our streets and needlessly pollutes the air. These cars slow down public transit and get in the way of emergency vehicles. And drivers focused on finding parking create a hazard for pedestrians and cyclists. There is...
The problem with very fancy videos is that sometimes they don't work. But all it just says is that San Francisco should nudge the price up or down, depending on whether the blocks are overoccupied or underoccupied.
Finding a parking space can be frustrating and time-consuming. It's estimated close to a third of city traffic is caused by drivers circling while looking for a space. Some drivers just give up and double park. This clogs our streets and needlessly pollutes the air. These cars slow down public transit and get in the way of emergency vehicles. And drivers focused on finding parking create a hazard.
Well, let's skip that. It always worked the last time. But some people think that the idea of tweaking the prices of parking requires, how can you do with these old-fashioned meters? Now, these are the first meters installed in the United States, and the people have the idea that that's how all meters are. You put your money in and you hope to get back before your time runs out. But just think, this was 1935, and it's amazing how little progress there had been until recently in parking meters. When you think everything else has changed, it's credit cards, debit cards, cell phone payments, and only parking meters seem to, maybe did change. Maybe a bubble gum machine or something hadn't made any progress either. But now the progress has come along. Here's the kind of parking meter that you have, and these are ones on the UCLA campus. And the interesting thing about these meters is it doesn't tell you what the price is until you touch a button. And when you touch the button, it tells you the price at that time. So you can see it's quite expensive here. It seems like there's an awful lot to charge students. $1 for 20 minutes, that's $3 an hour, and then the second hour is $4. But it's different at different times of day, and of course it's different in different locations. Now, here's where they are. This is some of you have been to UCLA. Maybe you got your law degree there. That's the UCLA Law Library, and behind it is Murphy Hall. And some of you probably think that professors have a lot of spare time, and maybe they do. So I set up my camera across from this and took pictures of it every 4 minutes for an hour. So these are 8 spaces, and I think that ideally 1 out of 8 should be vacant. That's about an 85% occupancy rate. So you see that the 2 cars on either end, they never moved. But here's what happened every 4 minutes. Some cars come, some cars leave. This was the one time when there was no vacant spaces, but 4 minutes later there was a vacant space. 2 spaces, 1. Once there were 3 vacant spaces, but that filled up. So it turned out to be about 60% of the time there was 1 vacant space, and just 7% of the time, I guess, there was all full, and sometimes there were 2 spaces or 3. But I guess what I would say to cities, does your curb parking work that well? In front of at every block of Brand Boulevard or any other boulevard with parking meters, do you get that kind of turnover? Do you get new customers arriving and leaving and paying, and they pay for parking, and because they're paying it, in this case at the substantial rate, they don't overstay the time. So I guess I would ask anybody, can you suggest that the price at this location should be higher? Should it be lower? Can you suggest any other way of setting the price of parking other than aiming for 1 or 2 vacant spaces at all times? So of course, the prices would be different in Brand Boulevard or any other street. I mean, the $3 and the $4 has nothing to do with it. The principle is that you should aim to get the price right wherever you are, and I don't think you can do anything better than that. That for the merchants and for the drivers. Now, why is this such a big deal? Well, because a lot of the traffic is cruising for curb parking. I mean, suppose you do want to park for an hour and it's 50 cents an hour at the curb and $2 an hour off street. How long would you be willing to cruise? We've all done it. That nobody can say they haven't looked around for free curb parking when they know it's more expensive off street. And there have been attempts to find out how much of the traffic is cruising. This is the summary of the studies that have been done. The first one appropriately in Detroit in 1927, either finding out what share of the traffic was cruising or how long it took to find a space. And of these studies on 4 continents, I think 11 different cities, over 80 years, they looked for cruising where they expected to find it, and they found about 1/3 of the traffic was cruising. It took about 8 minutes to find a space. Here's a study that was done in Chicago just before World War II, and very clever. I think they hired students to stand on every corner and note the license plate and the exact time every car passed and which direction it went. And then they were able to recreate the path of travel for every one of these cars. And you can see that some people, say the lower left, they were fixated on parking in one block, and other people were sort of open to new ideas and sort of were adventurous, and maybe things will be better on a different block. But a lot of the traffic in some areas is cruising for parking. And this leads to accidents, that the drivers are focused on finding a curb space. They neglect pedestrians and bicyclists, and they're constantly looking to see if somebody maybe has their hand in their pocket ready to pull out the key to their car. And this leads to some dangerous behavior. I've seen in Westwood Village, cars make a U-turn in the middle of the street because they see a vacant space on the other side. Here's some grainy footage of what they got in San Francisco. Well, I was able to talk to the driver afterwards, and she told me that she does whatever it takes to find a curb parking space in San Francisco. She knows how hard it is to get one. So I think that's one of the benefits of getting the price right, is that you won't have to have people competing for these parking spaces. So here's the summary of what we found in Westwood Village, that we studied cruising for a year, how long it took to find a space and how far you had to travel to do it. And on average, in Westwood Village, about 2 cars were circling every block hunting for a curb parking space. And it took about 3 minutes to find a space. Now, 3 minutes, that's not much, is it, if you're going to save a lot of money? We'd all do that. We all do it. But that adds up, because if everybody who was searching for a parking space takes 3 minutes, over the course of a year, that added almost 1 million vehicle miles of travel hunting for underpriced curb parking in Westwood Village. Now, that's 4 trips to the moon, or 36 trips around the earth hunting for mispriced curb parking. If you got the price of parking right, like on the right-hand side, there would be no cruising at all. Nobody could say that it's hard to find a place for parking, to park in Westwood. Now, some people say it's un-American to charge for parking. You know, it's just part of our culture. You can't charge for parking. But I think it's very American to ask people to pay for what they use. Here's a picture taken during the 1984 Olympics around the Coliseum. And the residents park their own cars on the street and rent out their driveways. And this happens at every event at the Coliseum, not just during the Olympics. So when people get the money for parking, they understand what the right price is. They understand market pricing and the charging what the traffic will bear. And I think that's why it's very important to return the revenue in a very visible way for physical benefits. Here's the meters in Pasadena, and some of you may be old enough to remember when old Pasadena was Skid Row, and nobody could have conceived that it would ever be far grander than Grand Boulevard or Westwood Village or any place else. It was in terrible shape. It was Skid Row. Most of the stores were closed. The buildings they were wonderful buildings in terrible condition. And here's what it looks like now. So how did they make that transformation? Well, the city wanted to put in parking meters, and the merchants and the property owners said, no, it'll chase the few people away to the malls nearby where they built. It used to be called the Plaza. What was it called? The Plaza Pasadena or something like that. And they had to argue for 2 years about the putting in the meters, and the city had to store them. And finally, the city said, "All right, if we put in the meters, you'll get all the money." Like that, they said, "That's different. You didn't tell us that. Let's run the meters to midnight. Let's run them on Sunday." That it wasn't the fact that it improved traffic. It wasn't the fact that it reduced greenhouse gas emissions or reduced cruising or anything like that. What made the difference was the money, the very physical use of the money. That they rebuilt all the sidewalks. They planted. You had wonderful new street furniture. They have extra police service. Sometimes they have horseback-mounted police patrols, sort of for decorative purposes on the weekend. And I think it was the revenue return that made the big difference. Here's a quote from Marilyn Buchanan, who's a business leader in the area, and she's chair of the board that advises on how long to run the meters and what to use the money for. And I think it was this connection between the local, they don't actually control it, they just recommend to the city council what to do, but because the locals have a say in what should be done, that they said the money would be used to stay here. The money would be used to improve the amenities. It was an easy sell. Now, how many places would it be that it's an easy sell to charge run your meters till midnight and on Sunday, and even put them in the first place? Now, some people might think that, well, the money should go to the city rather than to the district, but that isn't where the big money is. The big money is in the sales tax revenue. And I think that part of the reason that the sales tax revenue would go up is because it is not true that paid parking will drive customers away, because the spaces will almost always be full. And there will be people who say that I'll never come to downtown, Pasadena or Paso Robles or San Luis Obispo or Honolulu or wherever else I've talked. I mean, there'll always be somebody who say I'll never come here again if you charge for high prices at night. But remember, the goal is 85% occupancy. So if somebody doesn't come downtown to pay because they don't want to pay for parking, well, somebody else will take their place. Somebody who is willing to pay for parking if they can easily find a parking space. And who do you think will leave a bigger tip in a restaurant? Somebody who says they will never come if they have to pay a dime for parking, and they'll drive around long enough to find a free space, or somebody who says, well, I'm willing to pay for parking if I can easily find a space. Who will spend more in a grocery store? Who will spend more in a jewelry store? Who will spend more in a shoe store? Somebody who said they'll never come if they have to pay for parking, or somebody said, oh, this is easy to find a space. I like this. So I don't think it's true that paid parking will drive customers away if the payments go to improve the metered streets. So you have your choice in every area. Do you want free parking and dirty sidewalks, or clean sidewalks and paid parking? And I don't think the city is going to lose from this. Here's the sales tax revenue in Old Pasadena and other areas of Pasadena. The meters went in '92, and that's the year that the tax revenue took off in Old Pasadena. It's not just the sales tax revenue the city gets, the general fund gets, it also gets property taxes and business taxes. So by giving the meter money to the district, 100% of it to pay for physical improvements that everybody can see, the city as a whole reaped enormous benefits from the sales taxes. That's not, the meters are not where the big money comes from. It comes from sales taxes in California, which is just about everything. And you can remember, some of you, that South Lake was, infinitely better and more prosperous than Old Pasadena. And now Old Pasadena has surpassed South Lake, and South Lake has just recently adopted parking meters copying Old Pasadena. The legislation is very simple. Here it is in Redwood City, that the city council gave up on, or the parking commission as well, too, I suppose, gave up on the idea that they could micromanage the price of parking, because they have no training for knowing what the price of parking should be at any hour or on any day. But they can make a policy decision that the 85% is about the right occupancy, and they gave the parking manager the authority or the responsibility to adjust prices to make it work, and they gave all the money back to the neighborhood, and they removed all the time limits on the parking. Closer to home, and they removed the time limits on curb parking. Once you get the price right, you don't need a 2-hour limit or a 30-minute limit or a 4-hour limit or anything like that. The most popular part of the policy in Redwood City was removing the time limits. And here's a quote from the Wall Street Journal on why it is important to remove the time limits. It makes it much more customer friendly to say you can stay for as long as you want, so long as you're willing to pay, and we're charging the right price. That means that you'll always find a space. Ventura, much closer, that they did the same thing, except they just turned it the other way around. They said we want a 15% vacancy rate, and they said that this is, then you don't need any time restrictions, and all the money will go back to the Ventura. Now, they just started that, and I was up there the 2 days before it started. Here was what the city looked like 2 days before the meters were in. And the streets were crowded with cars. The spaces were all full, and whenever any car pulled out, almost always the next car in the traffic pulled in, which implied to me that most of that traffic was hunting for a free space. So you could see they put up these signs saying, parking pay station starting September 14th, which is, 2-3 weeks ago, and they say, well, it's Sunday through Thursday, 10 to 10, Friday to Saturday, 10 to midnight. And you can see the meter on the other side of the street, the same kind as you have here, and there's this big sign on it, which I think is very important, that all the money is going to be used for a cleaner downtown. You have to be so forthright about this. You have to trumpet it and have things that you can show them and dangle it in front of them. Say, if you want these new services, like better street furniture or better lighting or get your alleys cleaned up or something like that, here's the way to pay for it. If you want the money, here's what we're offering you. Is the right price to curb parking. And here's the mayor posted it and said what we're doing, and there were a lot of comments on it. Here's one of them. Now, I don't know whether Mayor planted this or what, but almost all of the comments were very positive. They said it makes convenient parking possible, but supports the downtown I love. Now, here's a T-shirt that my students gave me, and they think that this is the way I think the world ought to be. But I think it is a better world if you pay for what you use and you don't pay for what you don't use. The right person to pay for parking is the person who uses the parking and not anybody else. Now, what are we going to do with all the parking cars that we won't need if people, maybe they find that they could walk or bike? Here's a nice solution I like. It's a sculpture in France. And what about all these parking structures that we have? What are we going to do with them? Here's a nice solution that they figured out in Amsterdam. You could do that here in Glendale, I suppose. There are other reforms that I like, that is requiring solar panels on over parking lots, or like high-tech trellis. This is just one variety of them. That they provide shade for the cars underneath, and they generate electricity right at the time we use it most. We had 3 electrical failures in Westwood today. So on a hot, sunny day, what would be a better time to have more locally generated electricity? And I suppose I'm thinking like a hot day today. You wouldn't want to walk a long way from your parked car to your restaurant or something like that. It'd be so much better if you could park on the block where you're going to a restaurant. Not just on a hot day like today, but also if you have a heavy load to carry, or if you have a sore back or something like that. There are a lot of benefits of getting the price right. Now, getting the price right won't solve all our problems. I did see one invention from General Motors. If it succeeds, I think it really will revive the American automobile industry. Here's the grainy footage of how it works. Well, I think that it would put you out of business if that we wouldn't need parking commissions or municipal parking garages or anything like that. But it'll be a long way from now, I suppose. Well, I'm an urban planner, and I don't think an urban planner can do better than to conclude with a quote from Jane Jacobs. And I think she is right that we're not a rich nation because of what we did. It's because of what we have inherited. And the Glendale is not a great city just because of what you have done, but because you inherited a city that had a lot of care poured into it, like the lobby of this city hall that you're trying to recover. So I think that it's our responsibility to have policies that the future will look back and thank us for. And I don't think they will look back and thank you for free curb parking and high off-street parking requirements. That's not how you get to have a great future. And then you can't do any better, I suppose, than quoting from Abraham Lincoln, that our greatest prose stylist as a president. And I think our case is new. There are a lot of things different from just even 10 years ago that American automobiles alone, by themselves, consume an eighth of the world's oil supply every day. And we import 2/3 of this oil, and we're paying for it with borrowed money. I don't think that's sustainable. I don't think that young people should think we're on the right track in our parking policies. But I think we have great opportunities to change them, and I think Glendale is in the lead, and I hope that you get a lot of credit for what you're doing. Well, that's about all I know, so I better stop. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you.
Thank you very much. Anyone have any questions for the professor? I had a question. In the places where you talked about this adjustable variable pricing, is that like instantaneously?
No, not at all. It's in San Francisco, they're going to do it once a month, and they just nudge it by, I think in Redwood City it was 25 cents. That's the 25 cents every quarter, once a quarter, once every 3 months in Redwood City, and up to 50 cents an hour, nudging once a month in San Francisco. So that people will know what price they're going to face. One, they'll have experience, or they can look on the web. The website will tell you what the price is. I mean, before you went on a trip, you might find that the price was 25 cents an hour 3 blocks from your destination and $1 an hour at your destination. Well, you might think, well, I'll park farther away and walk more. Prices will be able to influence your decisions, or maybe you would even think that I'll park for a shorter time, or you could carpool. There are lots of things you can do to adjust to react to prices, but I think it doesn't have to be. It isn't real time. It's just changed maybe once a month, but it will be different at different times of day and in different locations. And I think it should be fairly fine-grained. As I understand on Brand Boulevard, there's some blocks on the northern part that are quite under-occupied at $1 an hour, and other blocks that are maybe more occupied at $1 an hour. Well, I think in many cases the price is too high. I think the price ought to go down when there is under-occupancy, because it'll help the merchants, it'll help the property owners, it'll help the employees, and the drivers. Everybody will win. And I think that many cities will get more money at 75 cents an hour that's almost full versus half empty at $1 an hour. So I think just about everybody can win. But they've started this in New York, and they surveyed drivers who were parking at these meters where the price had just changed, and over half of the people who had previously parked in the previous month didn't notice that the price had changed. And in many cases, visitors, they will have no idea that the price had changed. And I imagine that most people coming to Brand Boulevard would never know that there didn't used to be parking meters. Somebody coming to the Alex Theater or something like that, they would never know that there hadn't been parking meters there since 1948. So I think that people, whenever you get out of your car and go to a parking meter in Los Angeles or Santa Monica, you don't know what the price is until you get to the meter. And I think that's okay.
Mr. Chairman, I have a quick question too after you.
Okay, go ahead.
As far as no time limit, Professor, don't you think that's going to impact turnover for the businesses?
Not if there's always 1 or 2 vacant spaces, because it used to be that when the spaces were fully occupied, you certainly needed a turnover, don't you? Because you're hoping to see somebody pulling out so you can pull in. That's just what it was in Ventura. They had a 2-hour limit and no price. So when they put in the price, which is set to leave 1 or 2 vacant spaces on every block, they don't need the time limit. It's the price that makes people think, if I'm going to be a long-term parker, I can park in one of your garages that has 90 minutes of free parking. And then not so much after that. But if I'm going to park for 15 minutes, well, of course I'll park at the curb and make it quick trip. So I would say the experience has been in the cities that have started this is they almost always eliminate the time limits, because do you know how much time I need to spend at a restaurant? Well, of course you don't. I mean, we needed the time limits when it was free. We don't need it now.
With less parking on the street, i.e. more availability, that presupposes there's off-street parking to take up the overage, and that suggests to me that your solution, although making on-street parking more available, doesn't maybe address the larger question of reducing vehicle usage, because those people will just go to off-street parking.
I'm not sure how this works out. Normally in cities, the curb parking is just like the frosting on a cake. It's the parking you can see, that everybody can see, but there's plenty more off-street parking. I think in Westwood Village, the curb parking is only 16% of the total parking supply. So you could, if you just moved 1 out of 7 cars off the street and on into the off-street parking, it's just a drop in the bucket for the off-street parking. That I think, as I understand your question, there could be 2 results. One, that people will move to off-street. The long-term parkers will move to off-street. But some people will bicycle, some people will walk, some people will stay a shorter time. I don't know exactly what it will do to VMT. I think that it'll certainly reduce VMT for cruising. That's 1 million vehicle miles a year in Little Westwood Village. And before you put in your meters on Brand Street, I wondered how much of that traffic was hunting for parking. So I suspect that putting in those meters reduced VMT, certainly along Brand Avenue, is it? Oh, yes, I bet it reduced VMT on Brand anyway. But that VMT is unwanted VMT. The people who were driving it didn't want to drive. They want to be parked. So it's unwanted by the driver, it's unwanted by the pedestrians, it's unwanted by the bicyclists, it's unwanted by people who breathe the air. It benefits everybody if we get rid of that searching for curb parking.
Yes, Jeff?
One of the things that you mentioned is that if you have a situation where you have fair market pricing for parking, you can eliminate requirements for off-street parking in terms of new development and stuff like that. I'm kind of interested, sort of as a practical matter, excuse me, how cities can do that. I mean, right, you gave us some illustrations from the Glendale Municipal Code of the X amount of square feet required for parking, based on different land uses. How do you transition to an environment where, say, a place like Redwood City or something like that change their municipal code to eliminate requirements for off-street parking?
Well, that's a good question. I think the changes needn't be fast. I imagine that they will be slow, and they will be just sort of, putting your toe in the water, like saying, well, suppose we exempt the first 5,000 square feet. Well, see how that works out. See if you have more restaurants. See if it works out. And then if that works out, maybe you could reduce the parking requirement for a restaurant from 10 spaces per 1,000 square feet to 5. And see if it causes any problems. No, I think it's a slow process, but eliminating minimum parking requirements doesn't mean eliminating parking, because developers will always put in parking. They couldn't get financing for something that doesn't have parking. They would think it's bizarre to put in something without parking.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I was just thinking in Glendale in terms of some of the developers here that are very much used to having to provide a specific amount of parking. It presents an interesting conundrum. Oh boy, I don't have to meet the parking requirement. That's $35,000 to $40,000 per space they will save in construction. But on the other hand, if they build a building with no parking and any businesses in it go bankrupt, then that obviously was a wrong choice.
I think that's exactly the case. And what developers do know is how much parking spaces cost. Yeah. And the planners never take the cost of a parking space into account. And what the planners really know about is what is the marginal cost of a parking space, because there are break points. If you have one underground level and you want to go to the second underground level, often that second underground level is fabulously expensive. So it could be, if they knew that it's up to them to decide how many parking spaces to put in, they would think of it as, is a second level really going to be worth it? It'll drive up our costs immensely, and maybe we would be better off offering everybody who works in the building a transit pass, or offering them parking cash out, saying if you don't take a parking space, we'll give you the cash, the rental value of it. So I think it will allow the entrepreneurs to do what they do best, is trying to find out what is the best deal. You know, how can you be most cost effective?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I would say that I've learned so much from your consultant. I think that the only way that really good things are going to happen is when the consultants get it right. and you have engaged, I think, the premier consultant in the country in understanding how you can better manage parking for a better city. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Mr. Chairman, I also like to, on behalf of the City of Glendale, thank Professor Shoup to accommodate us in his schedule to be here. And as you saw, I mean, we're very proud of what we've done in Glendale in terms of the changes that have occurred that I would say 10 years ago this would not have happened. So we are changing with the trends that you see out there in terms of parking management, parking pricing, strategies. And we've done some tweaking with the durations at the administrative level rather than bring it up because that's how council has authorized it. I think in terms of the rate changes, that's something we certainly would like to look at in terms of changing the rates in the future, but kind of wanted to let the dust settle and see how things are working and get merchants and everybody on board. And some of the ideas as far as the use of the funds that are being generated, as you know, that's a policy issue. We are going to present that to the City Council for the Downtown Mobility Fund and get some direction or give them options or recommendations. How do you use that fund and when, in what shape or form? So
yeah, you certainly made some very compelling arguments to use it locally there.
That's right. So those are types of things we will be bringing to the Commission and the City Council in the future.
Okay, very good. Okay, next item.
Item 5B, South Brand Parking Study.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Transportation Parking Commission, if you recall, recently the Transportation Parking Commission looked at Windsor Drive as part of our preferential parking program, and we implemented preferential parking on Windsor Drive, and that was a concern. It became a concern, technically. It kind of triggered a number of things in terms of concerns from the auto dealers in the area that were using the on-street parking, employees that were parking. There was concerns from adjacent residential streets that now that Windsor Drive is only for Windsor Drive residents, they used to park there and that shifted the problem. And so that's been an issue that we've been basically struggling with in terms of preferential parking program, that it becomes sometimes a Band-Aid solution. You solve the problem in one block, you shift it to the next block and the next block and the next block. And that's exacerbated by the fact that you have a very robust auto dealership area, retail, and a lot of employees that have worked there for many, many years. And those auto dealers have been in existence for many, many years. So, who's got the right to the curb parking we were discussing earlier? And can we come up with solutions and ideas, strategies that can make it work for everybody? For the auto dealers, because some of them who have built new auto dealerships, they've been able to add more parking. The ones that are existing and they're locked in, they don't have enough land to develop or expand, and they have to make a business decision in terms of building more parking for the new cars that they have to sell versus building more parking for the employees that are working there. So that's a balancing act. So we retain at the recommendation staff and the Transportation Parking Commission Council authorized us to retain to do a study in order to go ahead and look at the downtown parking requirements in the South Brand area. And at the same time, the City Council put in a moratorium in preferential parking in the South Brand area. So we're not processing any preferential parking requests or petitions right now, although there's been a lot of inquiries recently to staff. So with that, Nelson Nygaard has done a data analysis that was developed with the city staff, and we formed also a subcommittee that Chairperson Welsh and Commissioner Weissman were part of it, in conjunction with members from the auto dealers and the residents or property owner. We had a meeting recently just to bounce off the ideas and the data that was gathered by Bonnie Nelson and Nelson Nygaard. And now tonight we want to give you an overview of the results of the analysis and the study, the data collection, and some of the recommendations that can come from this study to the Transportation Parking Commission, eventually the City Council. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Bonnie Nelson to present the South Brand parking study.
Thank you, Chairman Welsh and members of the committee. As you know, we were involved in the implementation of parking meters on North Brand, and what we have on South Brand is a very different situation. On South Brand, not really a downtown street character. It's affectionately known as the Boulevard of Cars. It's lined with car dealers. You have customers that are parking, employee parking needs, and residential parking needs that are all conflicting on the residential streets. We were asked to take a look at this study area, to understand the existing parking regulations, to take a look at the capacity for parking on Brand and on the adjoining streets. We looked at on-street occupancy and off-street residential parking issues, and we did a survey of employers and employees on Brand Boulevard to better understand where people are parking and why. We've come to some preliminary conclusions, which we'll be presenting to you tonight. The goals that we kept in mind as we went through this study was that we want to ensure the economic vitality of this corridor. We recognize that the car dealers on the Boulevard of Cars are extremely important to the economic engine of Glendale, and we want to keep them healthy. We want to improve at the same time the quality of life for local residents who feel that they are impacted by employee parking in their neighborhoods, and we want to maximize the use of valuable street space throughout this study area at all times of day. As Professor Shoup has mentioned, a curb space is a limited resource, and it has to be managed because there is more demand for it than there is a space available. We wanted to evaluate the existing parking policies of the city and do a little bit of a best practices evaluation compared to some of your geographic and national peers. The goal is to manage to meet the diverse parking needs of residents, employees, customers, and visitors to this area. There are many different markets, and we'll talk about that as we go along, and to develop a program of parking regulation or management that can be easily monitored and enforced, because there is nothing worse than putting regulations in place that are impossible to enforce. Pretty soon people recognize that they won't be enforced, and then there was no point in regulating. We wanted to establish a data-driven methodology so that we knew we were dealing with reality and challenge people's preconceived ideas about parking. When we met as a task force last week, I felt like the employers and the residents who were represented at that task force were in some ways equally upset by our recommendations, which usually makes me feel like we've done a pretty fair job. And we wanted to be sure that we understood the needs of everybody who uses the street by doing an on-street occupancy study. This is a very large study area, bounded on the north by Colorado, on the south by San Fernando, on the east by South Glendale, and on the west by South Central, with Brand, basically bisecting vertically the study area. And when we look at parking regulations, this map is impossible to read for a reason. Virtually every block in the study area has some form of parking regulation, and they're a complete crazy quilt of regulations. There's some 24/7 residential parking, some 2 hours allowed Monday to Friday, there's street sweeping, there's time restrictions, there's color curbs for loading and for disabled parking. It's completely ad hoc in the way that it has been implemented. And you can see on some of the blocks that the parking regulations are in the neighborhood parking zones are completely different depending on what block face you're parked on. And again, this just points out some of the crazy quilt that we have of regulations throughout the study area. We did an on-street occupancy study. The city collected the data. They had a car circulating through the area on both a weekday, Tuesday, June 8th, and on a Saturday, also in June. On the weekday, we collected data from 6 in the morning till 10 at night, and on Saturday from 8 o'clock in the morning till 8 o'clock at night. We took an inventory of every space on the street based on the average length that it takes to park a car. I should point out that that is an imprecise science since there aren't designated parking stalls on the street. Sometimes you'll find a street where people have decided to leave half a car length between them and the car in front of them. That effectively reduces the capacity. We determine the capacity by measuring the length of the street, deducting driveways, deducting loading zones, deducting places where you can't park, and then seeing how many parking spaces you could get in that area. We started with the overall study area, which I said was very large. We divided it into 8 sub-areas that are each relatively contained by arterials around them. And then we looked at individual street segments and indeed individual blocks. And if you have a copy of our report, in the appendix of the report, you should be able to find any block in the study area and take a look at where it stood in on occupancy compared to the 85% standard, which is what we used as a standard for occupancy. For example, if you take a look at Palmer Avenue, one of the things that we find is that you have very little crossing of Brand Boulevard. Brand Boulevard is a hard street to cross, and it serves as a real barrier for people. And so there are some significant differences between what's happening on West Palmer and on East Palmer. On West Palmer, you see the horizontal line there represents 85% and is in the same spot on all of the graphs that you're going to see tonight. So there's our 85% line. Our solid line, the blue line, is the Tuesday occupancy. Find it there. There's our Tuesday occupancy line. And the red lines are the Saturday occupancy line. And what you find is that on the east side, on East Palmer, from Brand to Glendale Boulevard, it got close to the 85% level on a couple of time periods, but generally speaking was under capacity with plenty of parking available, particularly on Saturdays. On the west side, West Palmer from Central to Brand, the street was well above the 85% level for most of the day, and in some cases over 100%. And you may ask, how is over 100% possible? Well, it's either because there's double parking or because the pack of the cars is tighter than we would have allowed when we estimated capacity. But the goal in all cases is to achieve a nice, smooth 85%, and that is essentially allows for at least one available parking space on any given block face. Again, as Professor Shoup emphasized, this reduces cruising, associated congestion, and emissions, but more to the point, when you come home from work at night, when you go to your job in the morning, there should always be a space for you on the block that you are looking for. So some of our findings, if you look at the study area overall, you would find that there's available capacity. That, in fact, the highest occupancy, looking at the study area as a whole, was 74% between 12 and 2 on the Tuesday that we did our counting. But that isn't really a fair statistic, because if you were going to park near the hospital, you wouldn't go park by the Americana. I mean, that's just way too far, way too big a study area. But what these numbers do tell us is this is probably a solvable problem, because within the study area, there is the capacity to handle the cars that are looking for parking. But of course, there are also some areas that are experiencing more of an issue than others, and in some cases, the causes are different. You can see here in the Tuesday data collection, a 95% overall occupancy in this zone here that is impacted by the hospital. You can also see high occupancy in the zone number 1, and even on Saturdays on that zone it's even higher, and we believe that that zone is impacted by employees from the Americana who are choosing to park on the street where it is free rather than park in the garage, which they have to pay even a small monthly fee for. But we also see during the week that with the exception of those two zones, any of the other zones in the study area are below the 85%, and this is at the peak from 12 to 2 on Tuesday, which again says to us that this is a solvable problem. When we take a look at 12 to 2 on Tuesday, we begin to see some real localized inefficiencies. We see high demand for parking north of Chevy Chase. We see high demand on the east-west residential streets, but very low demand on Brand itself. That's really important. We're seeing occupancies on Brand Boulevard below 50% during the peak of the peak during the weekday, at the same time that the adjoining residential blocks are approaching 100%. We're seeing, again, that the highest demand, as I mentioned, we've got very high demand on Saturday in the zone number 1, which is being impacted by the Americana, particularly because they have especially high employment on the weekends with part-time workers who would not want to pay for parking, a monthly parking permit at the Americana, but who will park on the street when they come to work. And we're seeing extremely low demand on South Brand itself. Very low demand in the southeast portion of the study area here, which is impacted on the weekdays by schools in the area, but which on the weekends has very little parking demand. We're finding that the way parking permit districts have been implemented in Glendale creates in some ways a perverse parking market. It pushes demand from one block face to another. Let's see what I have here. I want to point out what happens on blocks where we have, for example, 24/7 permit parking and the next block over does not. Take a look at these graphs of East Windsor, which has 24/7 permit parking, and some of the blocks around it. East Windsor is in this corner, and our highest occupancy on East Windsor was 72%, I believe. My glasses are not as good as they should be. 73%. 73%. And that was early in the morning, as employees are arriving before people have left for work for the day. We have occupancies at the peak hour on East Windsor that are somewhere around 60%. That means there were 3 or 4 parking spaces available. When I arrived this afternoon, I went to East Windsor to take a look, just to be sure these statistics held out, and there were 3 parking spaces available on that block. But look what happens to the blocks around it. We have West Windsor, central to Brand over here, where we're at over 85% for most of the day, and we have West Garfield and West Maple, where we are approaching 100% for most of the day, over 85% most of the day on the adjoining blocks. What is going to happen is these individual blocks will be coming to you for the same 24/7 permit zone because they will want what East Windsor has. And either you will be faced with granting or not granting individual block-by-block incremental residential parking, or you will have to come up with a better, broader solution. When we take a look at South Brand itself, we divide South Brand into 4 segments: Colorado to Maple, Maple to Chevy Chase to Los Feliz, and Los Feliz to San Fernando, to essentially mirror our zone system. And what we're finding is, if you look at South Brand Boulevard overall, again, we don't look at the street overall except to ask ourselves a question: is this a solvable problem? Take a look at the occupancies overall on South Brand. Generally speaking, around 50%, which is an amazingly low number for a downtown street, and is a much lower number than any of the residential streets surrounding South Brand. Taking a look at the 4 segments, even when you break it down into 4 segments during the weekday, you never approach 85% on South Brand. On Saturdays, from Colorado to Maple, again, you are impacted by the shopping center. You do approach 85%. But other than that, generally speaking, South Brand has plenty of parking capacity available. Now, we were asked when we met with the task force whether, if you simply moved cars from the residential streets where you're having a parking problem, what if you took those cars and moved them to South Brand? Would that alone solve the problem? And the answer is, it would go a long way, but it would not alone solve the problem. And we'll talk about that some more in a minute. Again, the 3-hour restriction on Brand is creating a perversity in the parking system. It's pushing demand out onto the residential streets. And I'll tell you, we surveyed employees, not just car dealers, all different employers. And what we found is that the Brand Boulevard employers are asking their employees not to park on Brand because they want those spaces available for their customers. Makes perfect sense. They want those spaces available for their customers, but that is overwhelming the neighborhoods. Again, we're looking at Tuesday here, and you can see that we have over 90% occupancy on the residential street, with 27% occupancy on the adjoining segment of Brand. This is from 2 to 4 on Tuesday. We have over 100% occupancy on this segment of West Palmer, and we have a Brand Boulevard occupancy of 63% in the adjoining segment. So much lower occupancy on Brand. Now, I mentioned that we did this employer survey, and we did it to assess the parking behaviors of employees in the study area. The survey was distributed to 237 businesses. We received about 1,000 employee responses and 288 employees from the 7 auto dealerships who responded. So while it's an 18% return rate, we believe that it's a statistically reliable sample. What we found, we asked employees where they live, and about a quarter of the employees live in Glendale, another 22% or so in Los Angeles, and then a nice smattering in all of the neighboring communities, all the way out to Sun Valley. The vast majority of employees drive alone. Looking at all employees in the study area, about 82% of employees drive alone. And if you look at just the auto dealers, nearly 90% drive alone. That's not terribly surprising. It's an auto-oriented business. We expect to see high auto drive-alone rates. One of the things we did find is that there is no single cause of parking inefficiencies. When we asked employees whether they parked on street, and we looked at the percentage of employees who do park on street, it is true that about 60% of the auto dealers' employees said they park in the residential streets. By far the highest percentage of any of the various kinds of employers that we examine. But I think it's only fair to also indicate that there is another element to this problem, and that we don't mean to be picking on the employers as being the source of the problem. One of the things we noted is that there is the existing off-street inventory for the residential buildings, 4 or more units, suggests that since many of those buildings were built before the modern parking code, if they were all to have the modern parking code number of parking spaces, there would be about 2,300 more parking spaces required off-street in this neighborhood. So we have apartment buildings that are under the parking standard. You might argue that that's a good thing, but if you're arguing for less parking. But based on the modern parking code, these buildings have a deficit of parking in the same way that many of the auto dealers have a deficit in parking. We find that the weekend work schedules are more dispersed than the weekday work schedules, which is very typical. Again, looking at weekday work schedules, what we find is that most employees are arriving sometime between 8 and 9 in the morning, and they're leaving around 5 o'clock. More than half of the employees have left by 5 o'clock in the afternoon. That's actually really good news, because sometimes if we find that employees in an area are leaving late, that creates a real problem for people who are arriving home, needing to park in their spaces on the block. What this tells us is we can allow some employees to park on the street, knowing that they will be gone before the residents return and need those spaces, if we can figure out what an appropriate balance is. We find that the majority of the employees from our survey are interested in commute incentives. The kinds of things that people asked about were commuter checks, which allows them to buy transit passes with pre-tax dollars, subsidies for their transit use, shuttle services if they were to park off-site, preferred parking for carpools, guaranteed ride home, and a whole host of other kinds of information. We find when we look at the total number of off-street spaces that are available from employers, we find that most of what I'd like to point out is this one here. Looking at the auto dealers where vehicle storage is a significant component, what we're finding is that of the total number of off-street spaces that are controlled by the auto dealers, a rather large proportion of them, there we go, about 2/3 of them are used for vehicle storage, and under 20% is available for employee parking. Now, I'm not saying whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. I'm just pointing out that while auto dealers have a large number of parking spaces under their control, those spaces cannot always be available for employees. So what would we do in an area like this? This is a little bit different than what Professor Shoup had been talking about earlier in terms of what you might want to do in a downtown area. We do have some ideas, and these are concepts for further evaluation. My understanding is that you're not taking action tonight. The first is that we've got to think about these districts and reforms within these districts as a package and not in isolation of each other. We cannot reform the residential parking without also looking at Brand Boulevard, and we can't look at Brand Boulevard without also looking at the residential areas, because they operate as a system. We are recommending a transition to thinking of these sort of 4-block by 4-block areas, those districts, as a parking district rather than looking at residential permit parking on a block-by-block basis, which simply, if you can remember when you were a kid and you had those long skinny balloons and you squeeze the balloon in one place and it just pops out in another, we have to avoid that situation by smoothing the parking demand over the district. We think we need to eventually, as we go to this system, eliminate the 3-hour restriction on South Brand, allowing for employees to park on Brand if they need to do that, adding pay stations like you have on North Brand if further parking management is needed, using pricing to manage Brand. We think that additionally pricing should be used in areas 1 and 7, that's the hospital zone and the zone adjacent to the Americana, where what is happening there is really about those particular uses and the fact that parking in the garage costs money and parking on the street is free, so you have that situation. The hospital doesn't charge employees to park, but the hospital does charge visitors to park, and it's a rather inconvenient parking garage in its design. We talk about that separately. But if you had the option of parking free on the street or paying for the inconvenient parking garage, you're going to park free on the street. But if we put some pay stations on those streets, we will move some of the demand into the parking garage. We recommend simplifying the parking restrictions so that they're consistent and easier to manage, and we would encourage the employers to develop appropriate commuter incentives to encourage their employees to do other things than drive alone to work and park on the residential streets. Looking at the district-based parking management, the districts, again, are outlined here. The benefits would be that we would allow for efficient use of spaces at all times of day, but we would provide benefits for multiple users. Currently, the way residential parking works in Glendale and in many places is you can get a permit if you live in the area, but if you work in the area, you can never park all day. You can park for 2 hours and come shuffle your car, unless you happen to be on Windsor, in which case it's a 24/7 prohibition. But what we are recommending is that a percentage of the parking permits be made available to employees in the area, and that those permits be restricted from 8 a.m. or 9 a.m., a good start time for when we know those employees arrive, to 5 or 5:30 p.m. Allow people to park all day, but don't allow them to park when the residents are coming home and want that curb space. That way, that curb space is shared. An employee can park during the day, a resident can park in the evening. Now, I don't mean to suggest that everybody leaves and goes and takes their car to work and leaves all the spaces available for employees. That's simply not true. People work at home, people are stay-at-home moms, people have multiple cars. We need to be able to account for all of that, but some cars do leave in every neighborhood as commuters go to work, and those spaces can be made available to employees. So some of the key issues that will need to be thought about, the way it works now is you require 75% of all of the residents on a street to sign a petition before you will consider it. What we are suggesting is if the parking district is created, that what would have to happen is a majority of residents would have to sign a petition to opt out. So the parking district would be implemented. If people didn't want it, they could opt out, but you would not have this requirement of 75% signatures, which, as you know, is a very difficult threshold for people because you have apartment dwellers. Sometimes you don't have access to those. There are language issues. People don't know their neighbors. People are already parking on the street, so why would they want to pay for it? So it is 75% is a very high threshold to implement, and I've been told in some areas it's taken years to collect the 75% signature. A question is the minimum district size. We think using the arterial streets, which are really barriers to define the districts, is a good thing to do. We also recommend putting a cap on the number of permits for sale. What that cap should be is an open question, open for debate. On Windsor, in the 24/7 zone, they have actually sold about 300% of the number of parking spaces. So partly, I think, because at $6 for a permit, even if you're not going to use it very often, even if you're only going to give it to the gardener when they come, even if you're only going to use it when you have guests, at $6, why not buy one, right? And so they have sold 300% of the number of spaces that exist, and you saw those graphs. We're at 60, 70% parked. So what the right number of permits that can be sold is an open question, but it is well over 100% of the number of parking spaces available. And we would allocate some of those for residents and for non-residents. One of the things would be, one way to do this would be not to put a strict cap on the number of permits, but a maximum number of permits that any individual household could buy. You could buy 2 easily. If you wanted 3 or 4 or 5, and there are some people with fleets out there, you might have to be put on a waiting list to see what the occupancy is on the street. You might have to wait to see if all of your neighbors buy permits and whether there might be some made available for you. We would provide, there's a question about whether there should be a priority for residents who do not have on-site parking. I generally don't recommend prioritizing parking permits in any way, but this has come up. And whether to restrict the non-residents' permit hours, which I do recommend, because we want to be sure that if we're going to have residential parking permits, that the spaces are available overnight for residents. We do recommend tiered pricing structures. What I mean by that is a relatively low price for your first permit, a higher price for your second permit, and if you're one of those fleet owners and you need 5 permits, that 5th permit is going to be expensive. Now, right now, you're at $6 for a permit. That doesn't cover the cost of the paper and ink for the permit, and it certainly does not cover the cost of the administrative time, including enforcement time for those permits. So we recommend that you charge the actual cost of running the residential parking program. And we have some ideas of what that might be, and I will share that with you in a moment. We recommend that you start with a pilot program, see how it goes. Since our task force meeting, we took a look at zones 4 and 6. We like these zones because they have very clear boundaries with very clear arterials on the north and south end and east and west end that we think people will generally not cross very often for parking. There are 640 on-street spaces in this area and 752 existing residential units. We looked at 150% up to a 200% permit cap on what would be allowed then. We looked at dividing those permits between residents and non-residents, and we're still working on exactly what the right balance would be. One of the questions is, again, how can you sell 200% of the parking spaces? That'll be ridiculous. But as I said, on East Windsor, you've sold 300%, and you're only at occupancies of 73%. There are other cities that do this, Pasadena, Ontario, and I have other examples. We could put a cap, allowing residents, as I said, 2 per household, non-residents 1 per individual. When you buy a residential permit, you would get daily passes for your guests, a total of 24 for the year. Additional passes could be purchased at additional cost. We think that to fully allocate the cost of this program, the first permit would cost about $36 and the second permit about $48. They could go up from there. Non-resident permits would be higher, up to $125 a year, which comes out to 50 cents a workday. Why would you charge more for non-residents? We certainly heard from some of the employers at our task force meeting about that. Well, our survey shows that employees would be willing to pay to avoid having to get citations and to avoid having to shuffle their cars. But we need to have the price set high enough to move people off the street to other options, to get them to try other ways to get to work. And we need to balance the on and off street pricing structures that exist. At the Americana, they charge employees $32.50 a month to park. Right now, the street parking is free. So if we charged $125 a year, you'd have to come up with some money up front, but you'd still have a savings. Some people would go into the garage. Some people would do other things. In Hermosa Beach, where they do sell employee permits in residential zones, it's $143 for the year. In Tucson, Arizona, there's a range depending on the parking occupancy of between $150 and $450 for employee permits. At the same time, we are interested in eliminating the 3-hour regulations on South Brand, to eliminate the 3-hour shuffle and allow some employees to park on Brand without overparking the street, reduce the spillover into the neighborhoods. Doing this alone would have a significant impact on the residential streets, but we don't recommend that you do this alone because we want to be mindful of the need for customer parking on Brand. We think that if this creates an overcapacity situation on South Brand, adding pay stations to South Brand to maximize the use of the spaces at all times of day, and as Professor Shoup suggested, allowing people to park as long as they want, as long as they're willing to pay. The cost might vary by segment on South Brand because the parking demand varies by segment on South Brand, with $1 an hour being the maximum as it is now on North Brand. South Brand has the existing capacity to absorb some of the demand from the residential areas, but the 3-hour restriction, removing that alone, would not solve the core problem, which is that we have localized hotspots and then some parking deserts in the study area. So we need a holistic approach, which is what we are recommending. And we are not taking action tonight, as I understand it, but I am more than happy to answer your questions.
What I'd like to do first is open it up to the public, get public comments. Then we'll move to our questions and discussions on that. So without further ado, I'll open the public hearing, and the first speaker is Johnny Harrison.
So, Johnny Harrison, Lexus of Glendale, and the president of Brand Boulevard of Cars. First off, thank you very much. This study was quite an eye-opener. I saw it on the committee. Very, very impressive about the data and all that was put together and all. It is a little, I think all of us were probably shocked if you've seen it for the first time to realize that overall there's not a parking problem, which is, as I said last week, I was quite shocked that there was not actually an overall. There's hot spots throughout, and I think that's some areas that have to be addressed. I think the concern is as we look at starting to regulate individual parking, as we've seen on Windsor, it just has that adverse effect throughout. The districting, I think, is a very good idea. I think it's something in turn we have to look at. I'm not sure about the percentages yet or how much control that's going to be done as it relates to all businesses, because the first two areas of concern which were brought up were Districts 1 and 7, which were never mentioned the Brand Boulevard of Cars. It was the Americana and the hospital in particular areas. So I think that's something we've got to look overall of the percentage that's done, because not only the Brand Boulevard of Cars, there's other businesses up and down Brand. Yes, she's absolutely correct when it talks about for brand's sake, what do we tell employees? Definitely. We don't want to curtail business from coming to us, that parking has to be around. So as we continue to study that, I know there's a South Pacific plan that's being developed right now as well to analyze the spaces of the land that's down there. I think that should be really considered at this time period as well, to think about sort of having those two mirror a little bit about who's actually there and where. The percentage, once again, I'll talk about of the streets. I think it needs to be really taken a look at the districts to make for sure it's evenly, and how is that set up? Is it, what percentages are moved and how can that be moved? Because once again, as a business that we offer off-site parking as well as transit, I give certificates and all the employees to use the metro, however we can do to get them here, because we know it's a challenge. We continue to do that, and I know a lot of my brethren on the streets are doing the same thing at this time, trying to analyze how the best way to use it and make sure that we don't lose our guest parking, as we call them. So great job on the study. I mean, vehicle storage, you see that percentage is high is because, well, we don't sell pins. We sell automobiles, which take up a huge space, which in turn also has a bearing on, as a guest coming in to purchase a vehicle. Of course, you'd like to see multiples. You'd like to see different colors. It's hard to say, here, let's get in the car and I'll take you up the street. And you can look at those. Most guests at that point in time say, you know what, I'll pass. I'll just sort of walk around. As well as, too, for the meter parking. That is something to consider as well with the events that we've had in South Brand, with putting up cones, just putting up signs that say no parking. People drove by and they just kept driving, even though it wasn't till tomorrow. They just drive by and say, oh, that's a metered, or in turn that's a sign that says no parking, so I'm just going to keep driving down. They won't actually come back, because parking, in my opinion, is really not a bad problem to have. That means our city is growing. City continues to grow with businesses as well as residents. I mean, as the reports that show both businesses and residents in that area, the amount of parking that's needed. But I don't think that's altogether a bad thing. I think as we look at the whole program, I think we have to be really careful about as we go down the path. I think the feeling that something that does have to happen, and some of the structure we've got to look at to do it, I think it does, just because of what we've proven on Windsor, that in turn it's just that domino effect that will just continue throughout the city, and we just really can't have that. We're too good of a city to have this fighting over and over from block to block to block. So I think it's time for us to really review and see our options. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
A question. One of the options that was not in the report, and I want to ask you, is what responsibility do you think employers have for providing off-street parking. And now I realize it's a complex question and you need inventory. I understand that. I bought cars in Brand Boulevard. But what responsibility do you think you have in actually providing spots, not transit passes, which are good, although we've heard in other cases where employees will take the pass and still drive. On North Brand, we've seen that happen. But what responsibility do you think you have in providing, parking outside the neighborhood? Because part of what the consultant is implying is that there will be less space available for employee parking. I believe that's one of the sort of the implications of what they're suggesting. So what responsibility do you think the auto dealers, and it really goes for the Americana brand too, and the hospital, in providing a parking at a rate that full-time and part-time employees either free or can use and not park in the residential streets?
Well, I think that's when you get into the percentage, what I was talking about on the streets. If you do a street by street about exactly how many residents are there, I look at it as, whenever you mention business, well, if I have an apartment building that I rent, I'm a business. So, to the aspect of saying just in general, if it's Americana, whoever, if I have spots and units to rent, I should have to be required the same as a business, because that is a business to me. I mean, that's if you're renting, you're not doing it as a charity. You're putting it up and you're making money from it, so you're a business. So the responsibility of it is the aspect of how many, basically the parking that's available to all businesses that are down there. Because the residents, unless you own, which the majority that do own, in turn have a driveway that I've seen. There's probably some that aren't, but the majority of them have driveways. The rest of them are in turn that are renting, that are using particular type spots, as what the report showed. Because there's several units that are in the city that don't even have any parking at all. So there's some dealerships the same way. They do not have any employee parking. So it's sort of a tough question to answer, only because of the aspect of what is required of the business. We try to offer it to our employees. Similar, like you showed up there, that there's somebody charging $400. I might have employees pay that. We have off-site parking. We shuttle people back and forth, Metro passes, and like you say, there's the employee that I'll pay for the Metro pass and will park their car. There's only so much as a business or that you can do to control your employees. Because it's sort of like, parking on the street, we require them not to. We try to put things in place, but there again, there's people that run red lights. We're not in total control of what our employees can do at all times.
Well, and I don't want to beat this to death. I mean, I'm thinking you would say that you would not want to give up any spots for inventory and devote it and switch it to employee parking.
Oh, we have.
Okay, thank you.
All right. You bet.
Next speaker, Steve Busjager.
I'm Steve Busjager from Star Ford and Star Mazda, Star Lincoln Mercury. I thought it was an excellent report. It does take into consideration both sides. Like Johnny said, I find it very interesting. I've never thought we really had a big parking problem down on South Brand, with the exception of the hospital, and I don't have any stores by the Americana, but I do by the hospital, and it's a horrible problem down there, and it's not my employees, it's the hospital, hospital employees and people going to the hospital. If you take that by district, I mean, that's wonderful. And, in front of that store, I think, my Mazda store, I think putting parking meters is a fabulous idea. We've got to free up some space down there. The problem that comes into play is that, just like Johnny said, if people see that you have to pay to park in front of that store, they're just going to go down and park in front of somebody else's store and not come to that store. So in that sense, I think we need to take a hard look and see all of Brand Boulevard and see what needs to be done. And I hate to say, but if you do it in front of that store, you almost have to do it in front of the other stores. And I'll speak for the Chevrolet store across the street, because that's affected by it too. That's one issue. To answer your question, Peter, do I think it's our responsibility to supply parking spaces or give up inventory spaces for employees? Very interesting question. Down at my Mazda store, down on Los Feliz and Brand, it was formerly my Chrysler Jeep store. There is, I have parking for very few cars. All of my inventory is off-site, almost all of it. I do supply, and this is an odd thing, but because of work hours, and we just put in, we supply parking for the female employees, and the guys got to walk. They got to find a place and walk. But we barely have enough customer parking up there for service cars, and then we have about 60 spaces out in front for vehicle space. Now, at my Ford and Lincoln store, we do supply some of those spaces are for employee parking. So, I think I agree wholeheartedly with Johnny too, insofar as most of those apartment buildings that are around there were built, and I've only been in town since the middle 70s. But most of those apartment buildings, I watched them go up, and there's very few parking spaces provided for residents. I also see that lots of residents rent their spaces out because, hey, it's a tough economy right now, and so they'll rent out their spaces. And so those apartment owners are just as responsible for the people on the streets as I am with my employees. And we will pay, we'll incentivize our employees, to find alternate parking. And most of my inventory is off-site in both of my stores, and it's 3 miles away, of which we shuttle people back and forth. But it's very tough to sell cars, especially on a day like today. Here, let's jump in the car and drive down to my storage lot. It's tough. So, I think the biggest thing I saw in your parking report is if we did nothing, really for 40 years we've existed. I mean, we've got along, and of course people don't get to park exactly in front of their house, but there is parking down there, as you said, and it's only 74% at peak times. So you might have to park a block or two away. I know that, and I've used this example to other in committee meetings, is my daughter rented an apartment in Santa Monica, and she lives on 5th Street. She has a 3-bedroom apartment. There's three people living in the apartment, and they have 3 cars, and they rented 2 parking spaces. And before she rented that apartment, I said to her, "Now, Julie, that it's tough to park in Santa Monica. One of you guys is going to have to walk a couple blocks in order to find a place to park." She said, "That's okay, I want to live here." She hasn't complained. And they work it out, and the first 2 people get home, get to park, and the other one walks 3 or 4 blocks. And that's, and that's what we have here. And I don't even think it's that extreme. In fact, it's not that extreme here. So, I'll go back to 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I had double the employees. 5 years ago, I had double the employees. And I didn't have anybody coming to me complaining then. It wasn't as convenient as everybody wanted it to be. But everybody found a place to park. And, now we're up against, trying to find places to, we offer employees to park up at the Americana, and people my employees would rather park 3 blocks away and walk than they get an hour for lunch, And if they want to go anywhere for lunch, they got to jump in a shuttle, go up to a half an hour of their hour lunch is gone. So we've got, lots of issues, and we don't have any off-street parking that's available down there that's close to any of our businesses. And even that's a solution. If guys will walk, or people will walk 3 or 4 blocks to come to work, that's okay if they can get there easy. But those are some of the issues we have. And but all in all, we've managed to exist together, business and residents, for a long time, and done it peacefully. And everybody. If a resident really needed a place to park, they could park on Brand Boulevard. It's just further away than down the street. So, anyway.
Okay.
Thank you. Any questions?
Thanks. Next speaker is Razmik Grigorian.
Good evening, Chairman Welsh, the honorable commissioners, and city staff. As if you don't know, for the record, my name is Razmik Grigorian. I'm a property owner at East Windsor Road. It seems that that's the little area that triggered all of this commotion. I would not repeat what I said about 2-3 months ago. I think it was February meeting of this commission. But I would like to remind you, and maybe you should recall all the arguments that was for that little section. Just for the record, let me just explain a couple of things. First of all, I thank Bonnie and Nelson Nygaard for this excellent report. It's very thorough. It covers a lot of very good things. And I think it's a very good report to start with. I don't think that's a final solution, as we all know. But that's a good report. Thank you. The second clarification is, somehow I was referred to in that task force as the representative of the residents or property owners. Actually, I am not representing anybody because I didn't have a mandate from any of those residents or the property owners to represent them. I sincerely believe that at least 99% of the residents and the property owners will agree with me and my stance, but I never had the opportunity to have to hear their concerns in a meeting, as maybe the car dealerships have through their own association. So with those, let me explain a couple of things. Most of these recommendations are good and great. However, the way I see it is these 8 districts that we are looking, as the report correctly says, are different from one another occupancy. Within those, each district, each street is very different from the other. And as Professor Shoup was explaining and showing the wonderful video there, was that apartment building or some kind of a building where the cars kept on changing and moving back and forth every few minutes. I am 100% convinced that if before this decision that allowed us 24/7 parking restricted at East Windsor Road, if we had that camera on Windsor Road prior to this February meeting of this commission, there would have been no movement. It would have been 100% occupied the entire day. And I think that's why the residents eventually got fed up and said, you know what, let's just do something better in here. So, and also one thing which I'm really glad to see today, and I encourage that, and is that the planning department and the redevelopment agency staff are here. This is a wonderful thing. And what I would really like to do is, if this goes into a committee and a commission and things, several things. The planning department has to be involved. The redevelopment agency have to be involved. The residents of that area who have never been notified of all of these meetings should be notified. There might be some volunteers who would like to be part of that task force, and the property owners also. What I understand is I was the only property owner in that entire region that was notified, and only because of the commission meetings that we had before. That's my personal feeling. So I don't think me, only one person, not representing this entire thing is even fair to the residents of that area. So if we do recommend a committee or an ad hoc committee to consider all this, I think there has to be proper notification of all the residents and the property owners of that area. In addition to that, Professor Shup's excellent presentation was basically concerning the general public. It did not cover the employees of a certain organization or a certain business. And Mr. Fuad asked a very interesting question from Mr. Harrison, and the two speakers before me did not answer that. What is the employer's responsibility on this? The city has certain codes. I, as a developer, as a property builder, in my apartment buildings, I have many parking spaces for the residents in there. That's correct. But if I do exactly the same thing, I say, you know what, these parking spaces can be money makers. Let me turn them into storages. My residents can park in the street. To hell with them. If I turn that into storages to make more revenue for my business, which is my building, the city neighborhood services will be there next door, knocking on my door and asking me to remove, all the illegal structures in there. Obviously, the dealers have spaces for cars. That's why they can provide some of them. They shouldn't be so greedy and so selfish and stomp on all the residents of that area. They should just provide some of these spaces for cars for their employees, just like BMW. I promise you, the moment Mercedes-Benz is going to finish their showroom, Maple is going to have a major problem. Major problem. There are several solutions. I'm trying to be as brief as possible, and thank you, Mr. Welch, for this opportunity. There are several things. First of all, the city and the neighborhood services, or whoever is responsible, should enforce the codes with the dealerships, just like with everybody else. Just one example, I don't want to really point them out in that sense, I don't want to put the spotlight on them, but BMW, we discussed, that has more than 300 spaces for their employees. They are not using most of them. If the city enforces those mitigation conditions or the conditional use permits with the city, we would never have this problem. Neither in Maple, nor in Maryland, nor in Windsor, nor in St. Louis. There is another thing that they could do, is maybe they could have a shuttle service for their employees. 9 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon, the employees can park in a parking lot designated away, and the shuttle service will shuttle them back and forth to work. That can be done. That's not that difficult. And maybe they should give incentives for carpooling. We hear all these incentives, but they never are implemented. They don't even follow the CUPs and mitigation circumstances requirements from the city. They're not going to do these incentives at all. And I really apologize, but I have lost faith in there. And we really don't want. I will. We really don't want to go back to the old days. We really don't. After this parking situation was implemented in there, the residents are breathing now, and I have filled my building that has had 3 vacant spaces for the longest possible time. I'm a business too. I have to rent my apartments. I have to make my mortgage payments. One other thing, maybe a solution, is maybe to require all the dealers to allocate a certain percentage of their spots for their employees, regardless of old, new, whatever, and that might be another solution. And at the end, again, my time is short, I thank you again for your consideration, but I really think that this is not a one-time thing, and I think the whole community in that area should be involved in any committee to come up with the solutions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Next speaker, Brian Gant.
Hello. Just want to acknowledge the beards that are here this evening. Nice beard, nice beard. We were here not even 6 months ago.
Please state your name for the record.
Brian Gant, 218 East Windsor. I'm not sure why we are here again discussing this, not even, 5 months after getting the preferential permit decision made by you, fine people. And I think you would have standing room only here if anyone had been notified that these committee meetings were taking place considering a study and possible changes in permit and preferential parking. I think it's really unfair that none of the residents were notified of any of this. Luckily, Roz let some of us know at the last minute. If you want to start with the pilot program, after hearing the initial study that Brand Boulevard has less than 50% parking where all these businesses are, why not start the pilot program with Brand first and see what happens, instead of considering taking parking away from residents? I should not be responsible for the employees of BMW or Mercedes where I live. And also, with all due respect, it seemed like a great study, but there's ebb and flow and fluctuations. Studying, going at noon on a Tuesday on a specific date does not truly represent what the parking is at all times during the day. I can leave my house at 1 p.m. on a Monday, and there'd be 3-4 spots open, like you said, and come back at 2:30 on the same day, and there'd be no parking, and that still happens. So it's not like there's all these open spots all day, every day, and we need to find some way to fill them. It's still almost a problem sometimes, and we have preferential permit parking. So, and the problem from the beginning was the daytime parking. Nighttime parking was full, but the problem is the 9 to 5 parking. That's the problem. So issuing any kind of a commercial permit to employees of these dealers to park on our street negates giving us the permit to begin with, because that is the problem. And saying 3 or 4 spots are open, if you grant permits to these employees, there's hundreds of employees that they just, at the end of my block alone, we're going to have the same problem we had before, which there was a study when we had our last meeting that was done where we had 100% capacity all day, every day. So anyway, I hope that in the future you will consider that and allow the residents to be a part of this process. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, John Travis.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First, I want to thank you for getting me in before 8 o'clock so that my daughter might be able to see me on local TV. We're taping Dancing with the Stars and another show, and you can only tape 2 at a time on Charter. Don't get me started with Charter Cable in Glendale.
But I'll get you started by having you state your name for the record, please.
John Travis. I just wanted to reiterate, I'm part of the Epicenter Windsor Road, and I was struck by all the survey, which is good. You need to do that. That's how it happens, going one day and what have you. I'm a stay-at-home father. I see the street every day, including all the East Garfield streets. I walk my baby around there. So I can say that certainly the real world's very different than a survey. But more importantly, Windsor Road, East Windsor Road, exclusively between Glendale and Central, is a microcosm of this survey because we are specifically talking about BMW. There is no other. I'm not worried about Ford. I'm not worried about Chevrolet. I'm not worried about Mazda. It's BMW, and we as residents that stay home and work at home, our building, probably half of them stay at home and work at home. We see this all the time. Before our preferential parking, it was BMW, and that was it. We have 30 spots on our street between our block, so that means probably 50 in the entire block. And that is also if you park efficiently and correctly. I would pray to have designated parking painted on the street so we can not have these 10-foot gaps in between or less than that to not accommodate for cars. But the idea is that, I would love BMW to be in the pin business. That'd be fantastic. But they're not. They're in cars, and I get it. And the idea is that we're not going up against a company that's making pins. We're going up against a company that has parking spaces. That's what they build. They build parking spaces. And Roz mentioned something about 300 spots. And I don't know if he was just talking about the 56,000 square feet on top of the BMW complex, which there's more space underneath, thousands of square feet. But we're also talking about the adjacent lot right next door that accommodates over 30 cars, 6,300 square feet. And 300 yards away on Brand, there is another adjacent lot that is 13,200 square feet with 60 cars. Now, I'm not sure how much inventory you need for 10 product models. I'm not sure. I don't sell cars. But the idea of a business in the car business not giving employees parking seems just outrageous on the practical, pragmatic sense of it. Doesn't seem rational to the people on Windsor. Moreover, the permit parking already has troubles as it is now. I think you mentioned something about a 12-month, month-by-month guest pass procedure, something along that line. Los Angeles does paper permits for 3 months at a time. We have 12-month guest passes that are being sold. We have people that on Louise that are selling, that are parking on Windsor. We have people on Maryland that are parking on Windsor that are buying guest passes. We have BMW employees with Windsor guest passes. I don't know how that happens, but they do. And when one of us confronted him, he just said, "Hey, I have a pass." That's all there is to it. Okay, fine. We have people in residential area. We only have a few residential houses on the block that also utilize their guest passes consistently. So even during the day in a normal circumstance, the whole idea of it was to be able to come home and find a spot, not be walking 3 or 4 blocks to our apartments. We already have Thursday and Friday cleaning, so that's 2 days that we have to get off the street if we don't have to move the car before 8 a.m. I'll tell you what, since I've had permit parking now, I don't have to park on Louise anymore, which I did previously. So the idea that there are other people parking on our street of any other business or anywhere else, it was very specific, and we could watch it every day happen. And that was the car employees, and I've talked to them I've talked to them since the 24/7's gone into effect. And I asked them, I said, "Did you guys get any parking after all of this?" And they said, nope, no parking. So they're still walking around the neighborhood because they go over to Central and they go to eat and they do all those things. So they have not been accommodated, certainly. And I remember somebody here being very angry that BMW was not represented in the last hearing, which I thought was pretty outrageous too. And they're not here tonight in a specific manner. And I would suggest that they have some responsibility here to at least discuss it with us. The idea of us not being part of that, notified about this, really outrageous. That's got to be fixed somehow. I mean, that's outrageous. And I know the survey said that I don't know if it said that they even talked to residences, only businesses. That doesn't really make much sense too. Come on over to our place. We'll have a nice little meeting with cookies, and we'll have a great meeting about it. But I think this is really a very interesting. Windsor's a very interesting spot, and that's the only reason why probably that this started the whole thing, is that we have a very specific situation. We just don't have any overflow from business there besides BMW. It's a massive 2-block business, several 100,000 square feet. And I don't know if Mercedes is giving parking or not, but of course they're expanding too. So as someone said, Maple's going to be part of it. So there's no the adversity to the parking situation now is that the people that don't have parking, don't have permits, are parking in front of their street and have to fight with BMW. Because BMW is now parking on Louise. Maryland has permit parking. I believe they have 24/7 parking too, along with 2-hour parking on Maryland, but I'm not sure. So yes, it's been moved to another block. Thank God. because I'm only talking about my block in a very specific part. So if BMW were to be truly responsible and just do the right thing, and apparently under the charter of the city, give their employees a place to park or do something to help their employees park on their property, and we would all get along very well. And I feel bad for those guys, I really do.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, Amparo Malari.
Good evening. My name is Amparo Malari. I'm also from East Windsor Road. I'm a property owner, apartment owner. Like what he just said, I was surprised that we had to go through the same thing again because it looked like we did solve the problem. It was very clear that the dealership, specifically BMW, was cause of all of these. So that when Professor Shoup did a survey, he showed one part where there was a camera and then the cars and were going in. If he had taken that on Windsor, just like what they said, it would not have moved at all. So the concern is, when they expanded and they allotted the 300 spaces, they should have stuck to their word to provide that. So now, that they are not, it becomes our burden, and now we have this main problem again because the other dealerships are questioning the whole issue. But my question is, why can't they include as employers the parking as part of their benefits to their employees, offer some incentives as to bus passes, train passes, or even if they had to park at Americana, at least provide shuttle every 2 hours. Okay, not a whole day, because like what he said, that it's going to inconvenience them if they only had 1 hour break. So then offer it, after all, it's just probably a mile distance, and they have cars around. Secondly, why isn't the city requiring that they comply to current code with regards to providing parking to their employees? When we bought the property, we did a rehab, and although it was built in 1930s, we had to comply to current code. So when they're building a new property, they should comply to current code, which part of it is providing enough parking. So, sure, we're also business owners, and yes, it did help. It did fill up. I have no vacancy as well, so it did help. Having enough parking does attract, especially with the nice building that we did out of our project. So I hope you would consider that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, Jean Brewer.
Hi, I'm Jeannie Brewer, Acura of Glendale. We're in the 1st District that does have problems on Saturday, and one of the things that I'm here, I'd like to introduce the fact that in our area we have what I call a lot of event parking on Sunday afternoon or Saturday afternoons. A lot of it is related to 2 very successful organizations, one on the east side of Lomita and one on the west side of Lomita. And we also have a restaurant in town that also has events at their facility, and so we fill up sometimes on Saturday afternoons. But this past Saturday, there wasn't a lot going on, and so we had different capacity, like what the residents were saying. But one of the things that has worked well for us, we do have just a handful of parking on our property for our employees. But we also have a handful of parking on our property for our inventory. The majority of our parking has to do with our service business, our loan cars. We need more space, and we buy more space, but it's all off-site. So, and we're fortunate because we do have the Americana close to us, and that's where we ask our employees to park. They don't pay, we pay. But sometimes it's more convenient for them to park on the street, and that's what your survey reported. So it was a great survey and kind of eye-opening, because I went back and said, hey, how come you're not parking in the spot we told you to? So those are the things that we're all working on, and what Johnny said was true. we're all reevaluating what we need to do to be better citizens in our community. We don't all respond the same way. We're all independent car dealers, but we do have one really important thing that we want to make sure happens, that our customers have a spot to stop when they see a shiny car on the showroom or something on the lot. We want to make sure it's easy for them to stop, because that will generate not just business for the community, but success for Glendale. And you all know how that sales tax thing works. So we want to make sure that that happens. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you and for the survey that you did. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that's all the speaker cards I have, so we will close the public hearing and open up for commissioners' questions. Commissioner Fawad.
I have sort of one very unfair question, and that is, supposing we did a version of all your suggestions, would there be enough parking?
I think the answer is yes. The demand and the capacity would be spread more evenly. Right now, what you have are overcapacity and undercapacity blocks, but you would spread it out more evenly. And what our survey showed is in any of those 8 zones, there's enough parking for the demand.
Well, like there's enough within one, like zone 1?
In any one zone, there's enough. Yes.
So we could have adequate parking for residents and employees.
Yes.
Without asking the car dealers to give up more space for employees.
Yes.
Without asking the Americana to may have a better arrangement for their part-time employees. You're saying, and you wouldn't have inordinate walks from zone 1 to, you could park in the zone.
Wouldn't have to walk from zone 1 to zone 7. That's right. Now, of course,
that sounds too good to be true.
If you think about it, the Brand Boulevard blocks alone are very long blocks that are very underparked right now, as employees from the dealers and other businesses on Brand are being encouraged to park off of Brand onto the neighborhood streets. By making those spaces competitively available, but maintaining the 85% occupancy, you would be able to move some of the demand off of the residential streets onto Brand. And by evening out the regulation, there was one of the speakers said, we've solved the problem on East Windsor. Well, you've solved the problem on East Windsor, but you've exacerbated the problem on the blocks around East Windsor. If we had consistent regulation, we would have a more consistent parking, which can be accommodated within each of those zones.
And your Brand Boulevard proposal, or one, I mean, I know it's not fixed, but would there be enough, by definition, would there be enough parking for customers driving by seeing the shiny car to stop?
Absolutely.
Even though those people would formerly park on the residential street, they're now parking on Brand.
Some of them would be on Brand. Some of them wouldn't park at all. They'd carpool, they'd take transit, they'd bike, they'd do other things. Some of them would park in the spaces that their employers are subsidizing for them on the Americana, but that they don't park in now because it's more convenient to park in the residential streets. They find it more convenient to do that, so they're not going to the Americana. So people would do different things. Their behaviors would change in different ways, but you would manage so that you would have 85% and no more occupancy on Brand, so that in every block there would be a space available for someone who wants to stop and walk into a dealership. Now, would there be a space right in front of every dealership if there are multiple dealerships on a block? That I can't promise, but I can promise that anyone who would want to park in any one block face would have a space available for them if you manage that parking correctly.
Well, I mean, that's, I'll take 2.
Well, and the proof in the pudding, quite honestly, the proof in the pudding is not just Dr. Shoup, it's North Brand. It's North Brand, where when we did the counting on North Brand before the parking meters went in, you were at 105% occupancy in some blocks. Double parkers, people waiting, hoping someone would pull out in the block that they wanted to park
I know.
in.
I was there on Saturday, and there were spaces. I mean, it was marvelous. So I think,
it works.
Well, okay, well, and without the dealers having to give up offer more parking space, and without the apartment owners having to do something.
Right. I mean, you would hope that dealers would offer more parking space. You would hope that apartment owners would make sure that their spaces are being used for parking and not for storage.
You're not depending
but
on
you're
that.
not depending on it as you are managing parking.
Okay. That's all I have for now.
What's the next? More questions?
Comments?
Yeah,
It's
please.
fine. Okay. Well, this is a just very interesting situation. I very much appreciated the analysis. And I guess my first feeling, I have to make a couple comments, is that, you know, the Brand Boulevard of cars is a very, very important part of Glendale. And there has to be that balance we have to strike. I know right now they're a lightning rod, and someone brought up it is, you know, Pacific BMW. Unfortunately, they're not here. Would love to have seen them here, but they were there at the epicenter of, you know, this when it all kind of started. I have, my concern is, you know, if we're going to be talking about the car dealerships, the issue of the inventory, I would like to know what the requirements are, because before I feel like we go into particular districts and start managing or creating something within each district, I feel like the blatant issues and problems that are facing us can be addressed first. And to me, that's going to be the issues of abiding by whatever. And I'm going to have to admit, I don't know what those specific requirements are between the city and the car dealership. That was before my time coming on commission to know. But that should be met. And while we're focusing on Pacific BMW, because their issue is just spilling out onto the streets, if it's going to be held for Pacific, it's got to be held for all the dealerships in terms of requirements. I am very heartened to hear you know, Acura saying that they're paying for their employees to go to the Americana. Well, why isn't the Americana paying for their employees to be staying at the Americana? I mean, that's one question I'd like to be seeing. Some big issues, Zone 1, Zone 7. Let's focus, let's check out Americana, let's deal with them, let's ask them just like we're dealing with the dealerships. You know, again, someone brought up the point, there's not just the, you know, brand cars, there's a ton of other employers on Brand Boulevard, and we need to focus. But since we're talking Zone 1 is the hot spot, Zone 7 is the hot spot, I personally would like to see the Americana help work with the city to see if they can address the overspill of the employees coming out onto the streets. I'd like to see Glendale Memorial approached. I'd like to see what percentage where their employees are parking. I don't know if I didn't see that in the necessarily in the report, but I would like to see where they are parking. Those are at both ends of the study. 66% of, I guess, of the cars of the parking spaces are for vehicle storage. Is that what I got from your analysis? What's going on with Orange Street? And this, how many of these dealers are using the city's Orange Street short-term parking for their inventory? What incentive? From what I'm understanding from the speakers, it's not necessarily much of an incentive to be offered space off-site, because on hot days, you know, to be shuttling back and forth, that's true. But I'd like to understand what the position is of the car dealerships with the city being able to help them with this inventory load and creating the space, and then getting the employees into their park. Because I agree with Commissioner Fuad, you know, what's being said. They should be, you know, if there's space there, they should, you know, have it for their employees. So those were my big concerns. But again, it's not something that, and they're the lightning rod here, the Brand Boulevard, but most specifically Pacific. But my feeling, again, just so I can make it clear, is before we go into those districts and start messing with the lives of the residents, I feel like we should press on that wound where it's starting to bleed, and there's some places along Glendale Boulevard that we can, you know, press down and see if we can control the bleeding, so to speak. So that is my opinion. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Weissman?
Thank you. One of the things I wanted to start off with is to maybe take a step back and look at the view from up here as a commissioner on the dais about what happens when citizens come before us requesting a permit parking district. I mean, right now, it's essentially almost a mandatory thing from my point of view. I mean, as commissioners, we do have discretion if we are to grant or not grant a petition for preferential parking. But if somebody comes up here and all their ducks are in a row and they've met all the conditions, it's very difficult to find some justification for saying, well, no, you can't have your permit parking. You've met all the conditions that are specified in the city code. It's almost like it's a rubber stamp at that point. And unfortunately, doing this on a block-by-block basis for permit parking means that we are being reactive rather than proactive. Someone comes to us with a problem, we react to solve their problem, and in doing so, I think it's indisputable that the problem gets pushed elsewhere. And that to me means that this piecemeal approach that we've been using up to now is not sustainable. We can't continue to do that. I mean, I understand under the current way that the city gives preferential parking that's going to continue, and I think we're going to have to transition to a district-based approach. Individual residents, may not care once the problem gets solved on their street. They can go away and be happy, but we can't, because now we have other people coming to us that want the same thing for their street, and it's kind of a domino theory. The other item I wanted to mention is that in managing parking, I'm convinced from the material that we've heard that price is the key factor. I don't think time restrictions are going to do it. I don't think other types of restrictions are going to do it. It needs to have an economic base, essentially. And I think price is going to be the method that we're going to be using in the future to manage the scarce resource of parking. And as you point out in the study, it's not necessarily scarce if you look at it, from a large area. But where you have these overages and underages, we do need to find some way of evening things out. And most of the suggestions that the recommendations from Nelson Nygaard in doing that, I'm in line with at this point. And I wanted to thank you again for an extremely comprehensive report. It's always nice to have actual data to work with instead of speculation. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Sahakian.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to answer a question that came up a couple of times during the discussion session, and that's why are we here today? Why did we do this? And the answer came from one of the residents, and I'm going to quote, "The problem has been moved to another block, thanks God." And that's the answer to the question. This commission wanted to look at the big picture. Taking one block at a time is not the answer, honestly. Not only that, personally, I think it's a waste of time for our staff. Preferential parking, speed humps, we need to look into them. But when they become a big part of the job, of the time that staff consumes, then it becomes a no-no, honestly. They have better things to do. Now, having said that, great presentation. I'm on board 90%. That's a good thing. I'm going to go back to one comment you also made that's very important, that's enforcement. Nothing's going to work if enforcement is not present, honestly. And that's something, whatever we implement, and this goes to my colleagues, we need to ensure that we are enforcing it. The reason that we were up in arms with BMW, and that is a very unique situation, and I do agree with the residents. BMW Windsor is very unique. It's unlike any other dealership. And we didn't see any other residents coming to us because of impacts from other dealerships, and that's proof to us. But when there's a conditional use permit, and correct me if I'm wrong, that 300 spaces on the dealership lot needs to be allotted to employees, and they are not, I have a problem with that. Now, if that is not the case, and I'm wrong, then I apologize, but that's what I was told at the time, that there are 300 spaces allotted for employee parking. Now, in addition to that, some of us commissioners went out there and drove the perimeter of the dealership. One of us observed that vehicles were being offloaded, 18-wheelers, on a side street, on a residential neighborhood. That's a no-no. That's a violation. All right? Vehicles parked inside the dealership in areas where designated no parking. Couple of locations. We observed that as commissioners when we drove. So it was a combination of violations that we saw, and of course them not being present of the meeting, and it was me that I was really upset. Added to the frustration that this commission already had from this issue, and the 24/7 was implemented. I didn't want to do 24/7, honestly. As far as residents being part of the process, I also recommend that a representative from the residents be on board at the meetings, and so we can get their input. And the last question I have is, why did we sell 300% additional permits more than the 100% on Windsor?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Salakian, our current code allows every resident who can demonstrate that they live there and they have a vehicle registered to that address a permit. So we don't have a limitation on the number of permits. So if every unit has 3 cars, that's what happens. You issue 3 cars and then they get 2 guest permits. So we don't, limit that. We can't limit it if they're legitimately showing that they have the vehicle that is registered to that address, and that's citywide.
And they need to show proof of ownership.
Yes,
for the vehicle.
we want to see the vehicle registration and a utility bill of some sort that shows that they live at that address. So that's verified, and the vehicle registration of the vehicle, and then we issue the permit to that vehicle on that street.
Now, obviously, some of those permits have been sold to BMW employees, from what I heard. Is there a permit number associated with a vehicle number?
Yeah, it is. And when we are enforcing, and that has happened and does happen, happens in the college area. We have a lot of college students. Unfortunately, some residents still like to do so. And if we can match the license plate to the permit and see they're not matching, then we can retrieve the permit.
Even with guest passes?
The guest passes.
The guest passes are not. No.
So the guest pass is basically...
Yeah, the guest pass can be abused, unfortunately, yes.
But the guest passes are being counted in your calculation of the 300%, yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Fine. Staff is correct.
And how many guest passes we allow?
We give 2 guest passes per residential unit.
And they're good for an entire year?
Yes, they're good as part of that annual residential permit that they receive.
So I think in L.A., aren't they just for a couple of days or one of...
Well, each city has a different requirement. Like Bonnie Nelson was recommending, we give like 24 guest passes a year, and so not necessarily everybody has that many guests coming in.
But that are good for one day each.
Yeah, right. That's good for one day.
So I think the selling of permits, I mean, I'm shocked that we need to...
It is, honestly, I don't think it's a widespread problem citywide. Unfortunately, it is possible, and we'll investigate that. We'll definitely have our enforcement go around and look at them, and if it does happen. We have gotten complaints, like, again, when we implemented the college area parking, enforcement strictly start looking at the license plate and the permit number is issued on that street, and we revoke a lot of those permits. So if we find out that that's happening, we will do that under the current code requirements or ordinance. Otherwise, in the future, obviously, we will need to look at it if we go down that route of selling permits at a different price, and then the guest permits could be a different price, or you don't get a guest permit if you don't buy a residential permit. Those are some of the things we can look at.
Did you have more?
One last question. The assumption of metering South Brand Boulevard, and I'm all for it, honestly, is that you're going to have more occupancy on Brand Boulevard, assuming that vehicles are not parking on the residential streets now because they're at 100% occupancy already during the peaks, and they're moving to the structures, correct? Now, one thing you brought it up, and that's a great point, is that South Brand does not have a structure.
Right.
So to complete the equation, you do need a transit service from one of the city lots that's going to cater to these businesses. Either the dealership have to, supply the van, or the city maybe, to make that move back and forth. Because without a structure, honestly, if you meter it, they're going to move to the residential streets.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to go up, park at one of our structures on Maryland, and walk all the way down to Los Feliz. That doesn't make sense. Thank you.
Okay, I wanted to address a couple of the things that came up, because one of the things that, Commissioner Weissman and myself were on the subcommittee, so some of these things were talked about. In particular, the off-site storage. My understanding, and perhaps Mr. Harrison can correct me, but all of the dealers pretty much are using off-site resources. They have lots, or they rent spaces. Is that correct? Yes? Yes. They already are doing that. So whether they're still making enough available for employees is a different question. And also the BMW thing was talked about. We had representatives from the redevelopment agency who came in and reported that BMW had the correct number of parking spaces, but apparently the regulation or the CUP was not written so that the employee spaces had to be separately designated. The number of parking spaces that were allowed were built, but they weren't necessarily specifically designating spaces for the employees.
So it could be inventory also? Then.
Yes, they're basically moving it around and using shared parking all over the place. So it's basically, if they had a lot of inventory, they were using the spaces for inventory. If they didn't have a lot of inventory, they were allowing employees and customers to park. So it was just a shared parking approach is what they were doing. But unfortunately, obviously it still had its impacts on the neighborhood. Anyway, getting into my comments, again, thank you, Bonnie, for the report and the analysis, and thanks to Mr. Harrison and some of the other people who were part of RASMIC, who came in part of the subcommittee, and I hope that we can, again, continue to meet in that venue as well as do a specific outreach to the residents, too, because I think it's a fair comment that we try to bring in more residents to be a part of the thinking process for that. Again, I am agreeing with my fellow commissioners that I think that this is basically the correct kind of approach, that we need this holistic approach to dealing with it, and not necessarily because the problem is so acute right now, but because we see what's happening. We see the results. It's all right there in looking at East Windsor. You had a problem, we put in the restrictions, and it pushed the problem down to so you're creating more inefficiencies, lower ratio of parking than is ideal on East Windsor, but it's exacerbating the problem all around it. And that's just going to continue to domino throughout the whole region if we don't try and approach this more holistically and do away with these inefficiencies. So I'm definitely all in favor of that. And that's really all I have to say about it.
Can I make just a few
Yes, please, go ahead.
I have a couple of specific points and one general point. One is, would it help to paint spots on these streets, parking spots?
It always helps to delineate spaces, because the tendency for people is to want to leave a little too much room between them and the car in front of them, but you create something that has to be maintained. and the painting of those of the T's on the street they'll wear, and you've created something that has to be maintained.
Also, the flip side of it, we'd rather not paint it because it provides more parking on street because, yes, people try to squeeze in between cars. So if we go with a 20-foot parking space that is technically, that is the standard, you're going to lose parking on street.
On some streets you will.
Okay, well,
Particularly if there's room for a compact between driveways, but not really enough room for a full-size car. If it's not 20 feet, you'd say, well, that's not a parking space. But if you're driving a Mini, you park there.
Okay, fair enough. Secondly, I didn't see in the report, you made the general statement there's enough parking in all eight districts. But I didn't see anywhere, or did I miss it, where in each district?
Yeah.
Now the chart shows it.
Yeah.
You have a table that shows that within each district there's.
I have a map that shows that, I think, and it is something that's in the report. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. This shows the parking demand on Tuesday and on Saturday by zone. And you can see that on Tuesday we had one zone that exceeded the 85%, and it was the hospital zone, which has really a separate kind of problem than the other.
Well, I guess my point is, I would maybe emphasize more in your report, either in text or just in more than just percentage showing, that each block could be within itself has enough spots, because, which sort of leads to my final thing, which I brought up earlier, is there's enough, we don't have to pull teeth from the dealers. We don't have to pull teeth from anybody if we just put in smart parking policies.
Right.
And in a way, this isn't rocket science, but that's brought home more if you put in within each segment, within each eight of the units here, it works within each of the eight.
Right.
So I'm just saying, as a matter of emphasis, because that didn't leap out at me as I was reading it.
I appreciate that. And in fact, these graphics, I think, were added to the report after the initial draft at the request of the city because they are so clear. And, while it is certainly still true that within a zone like, say, Zone 5, which only had 67% occupancy, I can't say that there isn't a block within that zone that is oversubscribed. But within a segment of 4 by 4, roughly 4 blocks by 2 blocks, really 4 by 2, you're only at 67%. So it is possible to solve the problem within any given zone, with the notable exception of Zone 7, where you are impacted by the hospital. And if I can take one more second to address something that Commissioner Rakobian asked, the issue in the hospital zone is not employees. Only 2% of hospital employees are parking on street. The hospital had a fairly recent change in policy where they were charging employees for parking, and they stopped charging employees for parking. Who's parking on the street in the hospital zone are visitors and people who are bringing people for treatment, that kind of thing, but primarily visitors, because the parking garage for the hospital is rather inconvenient and not really well designed, which if you've been there, I'm sure you agree, and it costs money. But if you can park on the street and you can park for free, then you can avoid what is seen as a problem, parking in the garage. And so by adding pay stations in this zone, I think we will both free up some spaces for the Mazda customers, and we will encourage people to use the garage that's there for them without having to change the pricing policy of that garage.
Let me just finish one thing. You divide this into 8 units. Are those sizes relative to anything? Is your thought that you can walk conveniently within that district? Because one of the residents mentioned it's different street by street, which I believe. Mm-hmm. And so if we're proposing it, however we're looking at this, we don't want residents to walk in an inordinate distance.
Right.
So would you say each of those 8 units is a walkable within that, or should it be smaller? Or
well, that's a good question. But I can tell you how the zones were drawn. They were drawn because they're bordered by an arterial street, and that arterial street, that busier street, serves as a barrier. These zones are relatively self-contained. There's not very much crossing across these zones. would you walk from, the upper corner of one to the lower corner of the other end? Maybe not. But would you walk a block or and a half? Or, I think that within these zones, you can manage the parking and have relatively short walk distances. One of the interesting things is that the front to back distances are, this distance is very short in both cases, easily walkable. This distance is about 4 blocks, and while you might not walk from the top to the bottom, I don't think anyone would argue that you can't walk 1 block.
And finally, people of East Windsor are concerned that what we're thinking about here is going to undo what we did for them. Can you give them some comfort that when it's all said and done, they won't be any worse off and maybe better off than they are now, or no worse off?
Quite honestly, no. They have a really good deal right now. There is.
How will they be adversely affected?
They will. Right now, their peak occupancy is under 70%. They may see peak occupancy go to about 85%, meaning there should always be 1 parking space available on each of the block faces. Right now, there's 2 or 3, and it's not that we only looked between 12 and 2. We were out there 12 hours or more a day, a weekday and a Saturday. Now, before you would implement anything, you'd probably want to repeat the survey more than once to be absolutely sure that we were there on a typical day. But on the day we were there, for over 12 hours, their peak occupancy on East Windsor was well below what we would say is maximum occupancy for a residential block. They may find that occupancy going up a little bit, but they should not return to the days when they were 100% and more, which I absolutely believe. And I absolutely believe that they are severely impacted by Pacific BMW. I want to defend BMW for 1 second. There were a number of speakers that said that they weren't here tonight and that was a problem. They were at our committee meeting, and I want to make clear to the other commissioners that they did come to the committee meeting that we had a week ago, and that they have been involved. And the East Windsor residents were right. They were heavily impacted by a single business that has a large number of employees and doesn't allow those employees to park on brand or on site. They've solved their problem, but they have exacerbated the problem around them.
And to give them further, so in some, they won't have quite the sweet deal they have, but they'll be well within tolerances. And the other concern is if we start selling permits to employees, that will overwhelm it. I think you're overriding, no matter what you sell or do, the goal is to never get more than 85%.
Right.
So
and if you find that
things will be restricted if they need to be.
That's right. And if you're selling passes annually, if you find that you're over parking a neighborhood, you adjust the pricing for those permits or you reduce the number that are available to employees. Right now, employees cannot buy permits in residential zones. They cannot have one. So they either have to park and hope they don't get a ticket, park and move their car every 2 hours, or they have to go to the next block over.
Or there's a black market.
Or there's a black market.
Reality.
There's absolutely no question that guest permits are being sold.
That's all.
Just, Mr. Chair, one question. Did you say that the dealership don't let their employees park on brand?
I shouldn't say they don't allow them. They really discourage them. That came across very clearly from the survey. It is 3-hour parking, so an employee would have to move their car, presumably every 3 hours. But the dealers I don't think anyone would dispute the fact that they discourage their employees from parking on brand because they want those spaces available for customers.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Chairman, just one of the things I wanted to leave with for staff and with Bonnie, I think it was just if we were to flip to the key issues that Bonnie had brought up in general, as far as it appeared to me that there is a consensus about the Commission in terms of a district parking concept and looking at this as a package because we have a problem. And we can easily remove the moratorium tomorrow and come back and start back to where we were in terms of implementing preferential parking. Citywide, we're also working as part of the mobility plan on the preferential parking ordinance to streamline that one. And that will have some of these components, whether we charge higher for the first permit or the second permit, looking at the petition requirements. that, if you just look at it from that standpoint, you will still have the same problems as you do, maybe as not as extreme where we have in the South Brand, in other parts of the city. So that could happen. One of the things that was discussed in the subcommittee was like doing a pilot program or a pilot area, which that's why District 4 and 6 was considered. And one of the things I wanted to get input from the Commission, if we were to do this, once we figure out all the mechanics, number of permits, maybe the value of the permits, etc., if that would be something that the Commission is in favor of trying, rather than do a big zone and go and implement this in 8 areas, in 8 districts, or create 8 districts, try it in 2 districts and see if it works, what are the issues that has to be tweaked, and how we can solve those before you kind of make it a bigger problem. That's number one.
Do you have to pass a special law or anything to do that?
That would be something, again, it will require a council action, obviously, because we have to do certain things, and it will take council resolution. Those are things we have to figure out. But in concept, I think if you start looking at a huge, it is a big district. I mean, if you look at the 8 zones or 8 districts together, maybe you start at a small scale and where the core area of the problem is, try to solve that, and if it solves issue, and the rest of it, as you can hear some of the auto dealers saying, well, the rest of the area doesn't have a problem, or we can live with each other. I mean, don't fix it. It's not broken or something. Maybe the problem doesn't go. I mean, problem goes away, or it's not as strict. But we have the mechanics of it to address it in zone. Let's say we start with zone 4 and 6, and if zone 3 becomes a problem, then we'll go into zone 3. Obviously, the public input is very important, and at a scale of this, it's very hard to get all the residents involved. We tried to get a couple of the residents to participate in the subcommittee, but again, they're only focused on their street. So if I get somebody from Maple who wants preferential parking, they will be just fighting for Maple. Oh, my street is, I don't know about the other street, but this is the street I want to deal with right now. So I think residential input will be better if we kind of put in place a program, and this is how it's going to look like, and then we'll definitely do a workshop or have a public meeting in that area somewhere to make sure that the residents or the ones who already have shown an interest in preferential parking, we invite them and tell them this is how it is. Obviously, you hear from the Windsor Street residents that they may not be in favor of giving up or having a limitation number of permits they're getting. So it's going to be a balanced approach, but I thought maybe we can get some ideas from the commissioners on the idea of testing it on a smaller scale. Try to solve all the details in those 2 zones, implement it, and see how that works. If it works, great. If it doesn't, what are the things you do to tweak it? And then expand it to a larger scale outside of those 2 districts.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Makes sense,
Other
yeah.
suggestions? Yeah.
Absolutely. That's the right approach. One question that I have, Rano, is if within the zone you already have preferential parking, now are you going to change that? Are you going to, like you suggested, sell guest passes or passes to some of the businesses? How is that going to work?
Well, the whole idea is being proposed is it has to be consistent. So we can't, within that district, we can't have a preferential parking, which it will be, Monday to Friday at these hours, and then the rest of the district have a different requirement. So I think if it's only going to work if it's all consistent. So if we do have a preferential parking in that district, that has to be removed and be consistent. Of course, again, we'll work with the residents in that district to make sure that it meets the entire residential parking requirements. So, like mentioned, if it starts at 7:30, we should have the district start at 7:30 to 5:30 for the employee parking portion, and then after 5:30, they cannot park anymore. But the residents will have parking for the entire 24 hours.
But what about Brand? Would you be putting meters on Brand or removing the restrictions on those sections of Brand?
That would be something to be analyzed further. Again, that is the tricky part. I mean, in 2, 3, or 4 blocks you put in parking, and then you would obviously have a concern from the dealers saying, my dealership falls in that block where the meters will be on Brand.
Right.
And then so people are going to go to the next block where there is no meters and park there. Obviously, they're going to be in front of another dealership. They will not even visit my dealership. So that philosophical discussions will take place.
Slippery slope.
Yeah, it is very difficult. So I think we want to hear from the Commission just kind of in concept if you're okay with the idea. We'll evaluate it further to do the bigger scale or to do a small scale and test it and see if it works before you expand it. That's a very tricky thing when you want to do a wholesale change like this. It's a major policy change.
Now, one more question. The conditions from zone to zone would be the same or they would change?
It could change or it could be fairly similar. Again, I think overall we're looking at the same problems, but what could change is the number of permits that are issuing in that district. Because as you saw, some districts were about 80%, so maybe you don't issue as many permits
that makes sense.
To the employees versus other districts that it's at 70%, you sell more.
Okay.
John, I have a quick question. I'm totally in support. I think that's a fine idea and a great approach to handling this this whole area. But for instance, let's say you're going to do the Area 1, and that, again, the issue of the Americana employees that are coming down on Saturdays and doing this. In part of examining Area 1, let's say District 1, would you, in part of that analysis, try to reach out and bring in Americana representatives to see what we would be able to do? Because my fear is, again, and I don't want to keep harping on this, but I feel like before you can look at the district, the big overriding issues need to be kind of like addressed. And to me, I guess that was addressed with the Glendale Memorial. The one in the middle, we'll say the Pacific BMW. My fear is that we're discussing it, it's being mentioned, but I don't want to say put the squeeze on them in particular, but I don't know how you can look into a particular district and try to work out these streets when that issue really, and it comes down to Commissioner Sahakian's point about enforcement. And I feel like that really needs to be handled. It needs to be a clean slate. We need to make everyone who's in this process feel like everyone is in it fairly. And I feel like in that particular issue, that's got to be seriously addressed. That's my fear, is we're going to go in and micro and look, but if there's still a bleeding ulcer, that's well, I'll say Pacific BMW in this instance, that needs to be addressed before we can look at it. So I guess that's my concern, and I just want to get that out because I feel like that's something that must be addressed.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I definitely we will look at, for example, Americana. Staff will work with Americana to address the issue of their employee parking, especially during the holidays, that it essentially shifts into the residential area. No question about it. In all fairness to the auto dealers, I think they've come forward and they are trying to be part of the solution. Not singling out one dealer over the other, but they realize it. Not business as usual. We have to deal with the employee parking. I know they've made strides with their employees. It's going to take some time, and to change the employee culture also, that unless there is some restriction and you get, unfortunately it's a forcing. It's like college students, you can't park on campus unless you have a permit. And that's just, you have to buy the permit. The college is a very good example. All around Glendale Community College, we have student parking. Once we put in the preferential parking district, and it was one huge district, and everybody who wanted to have preferential parking, they could buy it. If they didn't want it, they come to us, I don't want to be part of the district. And that worked. Some areas farther from the college, they didn't want to buy the permit, and we didn't give it to them. We removed it out of the entire zone. So it's going to have to be a lot of education, partly restrictions, limitations, and compliance by everyone, including the residents, that they would have to comply, not sell permits. They were trying to solve your problem, and then you turn around and sell the permits. Very common in permit parking.
And I'm sorry, I also want to make that, I'm not trying to single them out, and I much appreciate them being here today. I mean, I'm very impressed, and I'm very pleased to see that they're there, and many of the comments and strides that they have tried to make certainly have impressed me, so that's not, but also, and I think a gentleman had mentioned, they're not alone, and also the apartment owners, again, with their parking spaces, and I know it's a really administrative web of difficulty with the enforcement, but again, at some point in this process, everyone needs to be held accountable, even those apartment owners, that they're not selling out those spaces that they have or using it as storage or whatever, but I think, again, that also has to be looked at when we're dealing with this.
Maybe the building owners, almost aroused me.
Right.
Mr. Chairman, one more point. Got from Planning Director that as part of the South Branch specific plan also, there's hearings will be set up, and that would include information about the parking in the district, and that would involve the residents. So there will be planning. Department usually does a very good job of trying to get, when it's a specific plan area, they will look at it. So we could get input at those meetings as well, take advantage of the gatherings or hearings that we will have in those areas to basically address this issue. Again, it's going to take some time. We have to do our homework and we have to do our analysis, but as Bonnie said, now we have the data to show where we stand, and then we can expand on that as we go forward.
In terms of enactment, are we talking about doing this as part of the South Branch specific plan, or this would be a separate set of ordinance changes?
Frankly, I don't have an answer for that right now, but we are planning to have planning staff, redevelopment staff, and ourselves, Traffic Transportation Public Works, and Bonnie meet tomorrow, basically analyze the outcome of tonight's meeting and see how you reacted, how the residents, the dealership, and the and so kind of put together a plan. Okay, where do we go from here? And then we'll be happy to advise the commission at your next meeting of kind of the schedule and how this can all work together.
Very good. Okay. Anything else on this matter? Okay, so let us move on to the next item on our agenda. Thank you, Bonnie.
Item 5C, taxi study, scope of work.
Okay, Mr. Bagdanian, please.
I apologize. I'll start over again. The taxi issue has also been a very difficult issue that the Commission has been faced with. You have the responsibility in looking at taxi owners' permits on an annual basis as they apply. There's been issues recently with the existing operators providing taxi service. They come in for their owners' renewal every 5 years. Issue of ownership of the taxi companies have been an issue. Is there enough competition in the community to provide taxi services? An issue. And how do we basically handle our issuing taxi permits in the city of Glendale? We have a cap of permits, only allows 83 permits to be issued in the city. Is that the right thing to do? Well, about 10 years ago, that was the right thing to do. We had issues. We addressed them at that time. We felt that was the way to go. Now things have changed, and again, it's one of those issues after so many years, you revisit them. Commission had some concerns. There was appeal of the decision of the Commission, went to the City Council on one of the owner's permits, that the Commission limited the number of years the owner can operate their permit, have the permit for operation. So a recommendation was made to the City Council. Council endorsed it, that let's do a parking study. Let's look at how do we issue permits to the owners. Taxi study. How we issue permits to taxis on an annual basis every 5 years, the cap, competitiveness, the process, methodology, all of those things. So we did some research, and I worked with Bonnie Nelson Nygaard to put together a scope that I felt basically addresses all the issues that we have been faced with. So that scope is attached to your report. I don't want to go into the scope, but we wanted to get your input, because as we proceed with this study and analysis, I want to make sure that all the areas that you had any concerns that are covered as part of the scope of services, if there are any areas that we left out, we can certainly include that. We can finalize the scope. And then I am working whether or not we will have to go to City Council for the approval of the scope and the fees. But that's something that I will handle as a separate administrative issue. But in general, I wanted to get your input if you have any areas that we want us to emphasize or we didn't cover as part of the scope. And Bonnie is also available for any questions you may have.
Questions of this?
Mr. Chair, yes. One thing that I'd like to emphasize on is the cleaner vehicle fleet. That's one that I would like.
That would be included as far as what would we be looking for. Let's say if we put in an RFP process or methodology in place, you could certainly look into saying, okay, how would you score higher in your proposal? And those could be areas that we will say, okay, if you have all clean fuel or 50%, or you commit to a gradual implementation, that would be the area.
Excellent.
Okay. Anybody else have comments or questions? Yep, please.
Just a brief comment. I'm very happy to see this, first of all, and part of my opinion of this is based on having read the Santa Monica technical taxi study that Nelson Nygaard did, which was also a very, very comprehensive plan. The scope of work that I see here is much, much less than that, but I think that's appropriate for what we need at this time. We're sort of taking maybe a high-level look at what the policy should be for how exactly we apportion and assign the taxi licensing. So I'm very happy to see this, and I'm looking forward to seeing the results from it. And I think the scope of work is appropriate.
Mr. Chairman, one other thing is just to highlight that we will also make sure, it's part of the scope, that they will evaluate the existing services in Glendale. Because, again, at the end of the day, you want to say, okay, what is it that you have? Is it working? If it's not working, what are the areas that can be improved? So they're built into the scope is a visits or evaluation of the existing operators, the level of service that they currently provide, so independently what we have, rather than us doing our own surveys or the cab operator saying, oh, we're doing a great job, or we're providing a great service, on-time performance, etc. That would be also part of their evaluation, that they will actually evaluate the existing services that are provided and then compare it to the peers in other cities and other operators and how that compares to them, like Bonnie did on the parking analysis or parking, preferential parking, how do we compare with other cities? This will be something similar, and that's one of the other reasons we selected. There's not too many consultants who are doing this kind of work, and there are enough information background that Nelson Nygaard has that can be used rather than spend a lot of fees of their time doing research on other cities and other services.
Okay. Anything else? Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, John, I have a quick question. As it is right now, is there, do you look into citations being issued to, say, a taxi company that's operating in Pasadena, Glendale, and Burbank? Citations they may be receiving in Burbank. Is that information that's available to us? Right, when we're looking into those taxi cab companies?
Yes, we researched that to see if an operator was operating in Glendale. Primarily, we have our own database. City Clerks keeps track of it. But we do look at other cities and contact them, see if they have any problems with the operation that they're providing in another city. If somebody's operating in Glendale and they also operate in Burbank or Pasadena, we do check that. If there's something that they've done, their permit has been revoked or something like that, we will check into that.
See. Okay, good.
Okay, I think...
one more question. Now, at some point, Mr. Bagdanian, you'll be coming back to us with a study, I'm assuming, and we can give you our input as far as... I go back to enforcement. That's another issue that I think it's missing, not in Glendale, throughout the state, honestly, all the cities. They have very little enforcement. I mean, they do enforce the permit. You need to have the permit and what have you, but as far as response time, as far as cleanliness, honestly, I've been to other countries where taxi cab service is years ahead, light years ahead of what do we have here. and I'm talking about one city was Uruguay. I mean, my jaw dropped. I mean, you think it's a third world country, not exactly, but the service they had was impeccable. Impeccable. I'm not suggesting you go out and do studies of other countries, honestly, if you had the fees maybe, but what I would like to see is to keep the service level. I mean, my vision is to have City of Glendale with the best taxi cab service in California. That's what I envision, that people should be able to say, look at Glendale. You know, they really take care of their taxi cab service or vehicle for hire service. And you can only do that if you have enforcement, obviously. So that's another thing that...
Chairman, certainly, and I've been to Uruguay also, and
you liked it.
Except their taxes are so small, it's hard to get in and out. But other than that, yes, they have a good service, and certainly enforcement is always a difficult thing to do. Also,
yeah, it is.
And you need the staffing, you need the dedication, and police department has to allocate resources too. So it becomes a difficult issue. But certainly, that would be a component of this we will look into.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so it sounds like you have our blessing on this relative scope of work, so unless you want a particular motion on it. So,
no, thank you. That's all I needed. Appreciate that.
Okay, so let us move on to the next item, number 6, please.
Item 6, Commission staff comments and updates.
Mr. Regnini, you have...
Mr. Chairman, as you know, we're going to be very active in the next several months. Many of these studies are on their way, and so we will be bringing those studies in the form of a study session or information that we'll seek input from the Commission. Your next month's meeting, October, we've set it aside for non-emergency applications that are existing operators that are coming for their renewal. We're going to be processing them. There's a bunch of new applications also that we are in the process of reviewing them. So as soon as that package becomes available, we will schedule those for the following commission meetings. However, these are the ones that their owner's permit will expire, so we'd like to get those out of the way so that their owner's permit does not expire, have the commission approve them. Or take any other action that's necessary. So the next month's meeting will be that. As I stated, also working with Nelson Nygaard, we'll be looking into a joint study session with the Planning Commission on the parking standards. That's it's in the works. So I anticipate in November we may have, we're still working out the specific dates with the Planning Department that have a joint study session with the Planning Commission that deals with this parking standard, specific some of the ideas that was being presented here. So those are the updates I wanted to provide to the Commission.
Okay. Who has comments?
Not comments, I do have questions. Well, what I'd like to know, Jano, is as far as Measure R and the ARA, the Redevelopment Act, what projects are we planning to have, or what's in the burner right now? What is staff working on? Just an informational bullet point that this is what we're doing with ARA and this is what we're doing with Measure R. I think it would be beneficial to all of us.
Sure. I'll provide you that information.
Anybody else? Bill?
Just wanted to mention very briefly that last week I participated in the Glendale second most recent pedestrian and bicycle count so we just wanted to say thanks to all volunteers who participated, and anyone who wants to learn how to correctly count pedestrians and bicycles. I strongly recommend that if we do it again next year, you sign up if you get a chance.
You're the go-to.
Yes.
Thanks for volunteering.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, we had quite a few accidents, ped accidents, in the last week or so, unfortunately.
I was just going to go along. I don't know where you were stationed, Bill, but I had the Americana and Central location for the pedestrian count.
Must have been
We were counting. Yeah, we were counting. But my comment that I wanted to make, and which was, I don't know if you guys also experienced it, but I spoke with Colin Bogart about this. unbelievable amount of drivers with their phones texting on the phone. I wish next year that we just have a specific one person out there just counting the number of people doing that. Besides the bicyclists and the pedestrians, I know that stood out to me as being completely shocking and upsetting, considering, in addition to the recent accidents we've had in our city. So I wish that could be enforced.
And what stood out for me, too, was the bicyclists. I mean, I think of all of the bicycles we counted, only 2 were driving in the street correctly with a helmet on. Most of them either were riding on the sidewalk, or they had no helmet on, or were going against traffic. It was, I mean, as a occasional bike rider myself, I always try to abide by the rules and wear my helmet and ride in the street, but I was flabbergasted at how flagrant the violators were. So,
well, I saw a lot going on. I think it hopefully made me a better driver, because you see a lot of carelessness out there, and I just took it down a notch when I get to a stop sign now.
Yeah.
Actually, I was at Honolulu and La Crescenta, so I wasn't at an intersection anywhere near as busy as where you were. But when I was finishing up the count Saturday, just before 10 a.m., Colin actually cruised by in his car and came by and talked to me for a few minutes. And that was the same thing I told him. I said, in the 2 hours that I've been sitting here, I've seen at least 24 drivers go by holding a cell phone to their ear. And, and he said maybe we might want to be making, but what that comes down to again, and you guys have been saying it all night, enforcement. And the big issue for that is, how do you pay for it? And that's why, at least with the with fair market pricing for parking, that's one of the things you can pay for. You can, don't have to just put in street trees and, improvements.
According to Professor Shoup.
Well, you can spend some of that money on enforcement, too, for that area that's where the money is coming from. So.
Well, to begin with, the violation, it's not a hefty penalty, honestly, unless you make it a $500 fine. It's not going to go anywhere. Besides, you don't get any points on your record. Is
that right? There's no points?
There's no points.
Oh.
So, that's at the state level.
Does anybody else have any comments or questions or updates? All right, then I move, let's go to the next item, please.
Item 7, adjournment.
All right, second to someone?
I'll second that.
All right, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.